the Imperial Era from scratch. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 1, The Newly Emerged Village Chief. David, beaming with joy, lowered his left hand, gripping the bow, and swiftly sprinted through the forest. In the blink of an eye, he reached his prey, a deer, wounded by several arrows, lying on the ground. He crouched down, set the bow aside, drew his dagger, and delivered a fatal blow to the still dead prey. He then lifted the still steaming venison onto a crudely crafted backpack, the entire process seamlessly and expertly executed. Hey, taking a deep breath, David struggled to stand, strapping himself to the backpack. The weight behind him was much heavier than he'd anticipated. My strength's gone, I hope it recovers soon. Shortly after entering the forest, David had already secured dozens of pounds of venison. He was delighted with his haul. If his luck continued this way, he should be back to normal soon. Carrying his bow and a quiver full of arrows, David headed towards his home beyond the forest. David, once an ordinary office worker on Earth, died young, and somehow ended up in this world. From his observations, this was a fantasy world resembling medieval Europe. The rigid class system also made him uncomfortable, having been a commoner his entire life. Raised by an old hunter, Otis, until he was 16, David, unwilling to give up, became a pioneer. To expand its territory, the Kingdom of Tiran encouraged commoners to become pioneers, reclaiming uninhabited lands. Pioneers who successfully reclaimed and occupied new lands could rise from commoner status to become knights or even noble lords. However, reclaiming territory was no easy task. After months of trekking to select a settlement and over a year and a half of hard work, David's pioneering team failed to cultivate suitable farmland. Coupled with a harsh climate, attacks by wild animals, a lack of food and medicine, and a lack of reward for their hard work, members gradually died or gave up. By the second winter, David was the only one left. He naturally received a pioneering permit and became the chief of the newly established village. However, after enduring a difficult second winter, David began to consider leaving. This deer should help me recover, and I can even make some dried meat. If I can find some wild vegetables, that would be even better. Carrying his main source of food for the next few days, David slowly made his way back to the makeshift village of just 4 large wooden cabins. One of the cabins served as a warehouse, a blacksmith's workshop, and the team's kitchen. David carried the venison into the cabin, placed it on a simple-looking table, and began to process it, skinning, gutting, cutting, and cleaning the meat. When he was done, he made himself some broth. He had plenty of ingredients on hand. The pioneering team had brought plenty of salt, sugar, and spices, and there was still plenty left. Sitting on a simple wooden bench outside the cabin, sipping broth from a wooden bowl, David gazed westward at the vast river and pondered his future. Should he head to another pioneering village? Or simply return to Iron Tree Fort? Should he return to Iron Tree Fort and become an ordinary hunter? He felt a pang of reluctance. As he pondered these things, a figure loomed in the distance. It was so blurry, so indistinct that even in broad daylight, David couldn't make out its features. What's going on? Is this a ghost? The translucent figure reminded David of ghosts, the undead, Nizil-Okian, and the like. Just as he set down his wooden bowl and reached for his nearby bow and arrow, hoping to bolster his courage, the figure gradually became clearer, revealing its true form. This look, the stained tank top, overalls, leather boots, ponytail, and mud-slicked hair couldn't conceal her stunning beauty. And then there was the stumbling gesture, clutching her waist. Combine that look with the raging wind, the biting cold wind, and the constant patter of rain pouring down the mountainside, and David would have suspected he'd traveled through time again. He was clearly seeing the famous archaeologist. After graduating from university, she became an archaeologist. However, none of the ruins she excavated survived intact, earning her the nicknames Tomb Destroyer, Collapse wherever she walked, and Demolition God. Now, she's just a rookie, fresh out of college, taking part in her first real archaeological expedition. On this seemingly ordinary excavation, she's shipwrecked and stranded on an island, encountering a series of bizarre events. After enduring numerous hardships, she helps her companions escape successfully, and gradually grows into a person of her own. The story before David should be from the early stages of the story. Standing up, David watched as they slowly entered the village, gazing at the man who also bore a puzzled expression, ready to attempt a conversation. After all these years, he wondered how much English he could still remember. While he was struggling to figure out how much English he could remember, Crawford, standing across from him, had noticed him and stopped a few meters away. The two were not far apart, and with a bright daylight, David, in this life, lacking any nearsightedness or astigmatism, could clearly see the surprise, confusion, and wariness on Crawford's face. "Hello," David habitually used the universal human language of this world. "Can I help you?" "Hello." Crawford was completely confused by what the young man across from him was saying. But after a closer look, he felt this seemingly righteous young man meant him no harm, so he waved and greeted David. "I need some help." The listening comprehension question wasn't difficult, he understood it, but the response was a bit puzzling. David set his bow and arrow aside and approached Crawford. Seeing David lower his weapon, he was certain this man meant no harm. Crawford immediately launched into a flurry of words. This was a headache for David, who could only vaguely understand a few words. Finally, he pointed to the wound Crawford was holding, interrupting him. In the story, Crawford fell into the sea during the shipwreck. Despite swimming desperately to shore, he was knocked unconscious. Upon regaining consciousness, he was found hanging upside down in a cave. Although Crawford escaped through his wits and courage, he also sustained injuries, the most serious of which was a penetrating wound to his side. It was hard to imagine that Crawford, a seemingly frail young woman, could, despite such injuries, climb snowy mountains and grasslands, while simultaneously annihilating the entire Brotherhood of the Sun, the mysteriously powerful Queen Himiko, and her numerous storm guards. Considering the rusty metal that had pierced her waist, and Crawford's subsequent performance, even unarmed, her combat power was definitely over 5. At this point, Crawford, despite her impressive combat prowess, was in a very weak state. Following David's finger, she glanced down at her waist, blood oozing from between her fingers. She knew now was not the time for such nonsense, and she also realized that the man didn't understand English. But she should be able to understand simple words, right? She tried to say, "I need help." "Medicine." Crawford watched as the young man before her pulled something from his waist bag, a small package and what looked like a bandage. When he opened the package, Crawford saw a powdery substance inside, seemingly some kind of medicine. Her attempt had been successful. Retrieving the powder and homemade bandages she always carried, David made several gestures toward Crawford, first, pointing to her own eyes, then to Crawford's wound, and finally, raising the powder and bandage. Crawford understood, hesitated for a few seconds, then nodded, then lifted his vest slightly to reveal the wound. Her movement strained the wound, and Crawford groaned at the sudden surge of pain. David glanced at Crawford's side, which was covered in blood, its natural color unrecognizable. In this state, applying the medicine directly was impossible. Handing the powder and bandage to Crawford, David gestured to a wooden chair near the cabin and gestured, "Wait a moment." It was a simple gesture, one Crawford understood easily. He took the powder and bandage and sat down on the chair. Crawford watched as David turned and went back into the cabin. He soon emerged with a basin of water, understanding the meaning. Sitting obediently on a wooden chair, Crawford watched the enthusiastic young man before her wipe her waist and abdomen with a damp cloth. Suddenly, something felt strange. She should have cleaned it herself. It felt inappropriate to speak now, and she didn't think he'd understand her. David carefully cleaned Crawford's wound, his movement sweeping away the mud and blood, revealing her muscular, white waist and abdomen. Feeling the wet, smooth texture on his fingers, David, who hadn't tasted meat in over a decade, felt a surge of heat rising within him. He gathered his thoughts, tossing the blood-stained cloth aside. He then took the powder and bandage from Crawford's hand and neatly bandaged Crawford's wound. His bandaging technique had improved significantly over the past 2 years. When he was done, he stood up and nodded to Crawford. At this point, Crawford also stood up, checked the bandages on her waist and abdomen, then looked up and sincerely thanked David. "Thank you very much for your help." "You're welcome." As soon as the words left his mouth, both of them were stunned. Because David was no longer speaking a language Crawford had never heard before, but English that she was very familiar with, the British English that she was most familiar with. Chapter 2: A Passing Archaeologist. "You know English, it seems like you learned it all of a sudden." David was also puzzled. He tried to think about it and found that he could use English knowledge easily, almost as if you were thinking in his native language. This was definitely not his previous English level, but more like a sudden acquisition of English knowledge. It seemed incredible, but David, a time traveler, didn't find it strange. After all the brainstorming in his previous life, he immediately understood what was going on. The Goldfinger had arrived. Looking at Crawford, who suddenly appeared before him, he had a few guesses about the nature of his Goldfinger. Although the Goldfinger came a little late, making him wait so many years, it was better than nothing. But why did it appear now? Had he changed significantly recently? Did he wait until he was 18 to activate it? David joined a pioneering team at 16 and spent 2 years in this remote place. He just turned 18 this year. Besides that, the biggest change was his status, from ordinary person to village chief. Considering Crawford's sudden appearance and the British English ability he must have gained from Crawford, he leaned towards the latter possibility. Time travel after all. Even though it was someone else who traveled through time to find him, it wasn't unusual. In his past life, he'd seen countless examples of time travelers appearing in his territory after opening shops, inns, and clinics. So, now that he was village chief, it wouldn't be surprising for time travelers to appear in his territory. It wouldn't be hard to tell if his suspicions were correct. He'd just have to wait and see if any familiar people would suddenly appear. If that's the case, I'll have to keep doing this as village chief, David thought to himself, glancing at Crawford again. Suspicion was evident on his face. This was perfectly normal. No one would immediately believe someone who just suddenly figured it out. Furthermore, Crawford had just experienced a shipwreck, been knocked unconscious, kidnapped, and strung up in a cave. He was bound to be wary of strangers. It sounds incredible, but what I say is true, David said, using a serious expression to emphasize his sincerity. Crawford looked at David intently, finally convinced by his righteous aura and accepting his lies. Okay, then, can you tell me where we are? And who are you? After his wounds were treated, Crawford felt much better. Though still a little weak, he wasn't feeling as unwell as before. Only then did she begin to focus on other questions. Where exactly was this place? How had she gotten here? How would she reunite with her companions? Earlier, while talking with David, she had carefully surveyed her surroundings. No matter how she looked, this was a plain. How had she managed to get here from the mountains in the blink of an eye? And the drastic change in climate left her deeply puzzled. This is the pioneer camp located northwest of the northern plains of the Ironwood Forest. I'm David, the village chief. Hello, David. I'm Crawford, an archaeologist. I was separated from my companions in a shipwreck and ended up here by accident. Crawford thought it was a commonplace name, and the northern plains was even more common. What is the Ironwood Forest? The Ironwood Forest is northwest of Ironwood Castle, the most important town in the northern part of the Kingdom of Tiran. Ironwood Castle. Tiran Kingdom? Where is the Kingdom of Tiran? David looked at Crawford, who was full of confusion, and continued to explain what he knew. The Kingdom of Tiran was a human kingdom located in the north of the continent. They were currently in a plain further north than Iron Tree Keep, a major city in the north of the Tiran Kingdom. Due to the Tiran Mountains and the elves who inhabited the Iron Tree Forest and had a very bad relationship with the Tiran humans, the Tiran Kingdom had been unable to conquer this vast plain until the arrival of a pioneering team 2 years ago. David's camp was one of 3 newly established pioneer camps, intent on reclaiming this land. If all went well, it would develop into a new village, incorporating the land into the Tiran Kingdom's territory. As David continued to narrate, Crawford's questions multiplied, threatening to overwhelm her. However, she forced herself not to interrupt David until he had finished his story. Then, she said, "You were just telling a story, weren't you?" "No." David spread his hands and put on a serious face, confirming that he was telling the truth. How is this possible? If David's description was true, it meant Crawford had stumbled into another world. David's description was sketchy, but from the path the pioneers had taken after leaving Iron Tree Keep, it was clear this place couldn't be some small island. Crawford opened her mouth, completely unsure how to describe the situation, and remained silent for a long moment. Only hunger brought her back to her senses. This is truly unbelievable. She inquired further about local customs and learned a little about this world's culture and customs, as well as the existence of mysterious powers and races reminiscent of fantasy stories. She began to accept the fact that she had truly arrived in another world. At this point, another question suddenly occurred to Crawford. Don't these questions strike you as strange? No, David had plenty of time to think of a suitable response. The way you appeared made me realize your origins were unique. After describing Crawford's unusual appearance, Crawford understood why David had remained so calm. He hadn't considered her an ordinary person from the beginning. So that's how it is. Having resolved all her doubts, Crawford felt a slight headache. Could she still return? While this world was magical and filled her with a thirst for adventure, now wasn't the right time for it. She was deeply worried about her companions. They had just been shipwrecked, and she didn't know what everyone was doing. Could they have escaped safely? Crawford, consumed by worry, didn't notice David had been cooking broth for her dinner during her silence. It wasn't until the steaming broth was handed to her that she snapped back to reality. "Thank you," Crawford sincerely thanked David, looking at the fragrant bowl of broth in her hands. "It's a blessing to have met you." "You're welcome," David smiled brightly in return. He was in a good mood. After all, Crawford's appearance meant he had a golden finger, a new motivation to continue his efforts in this place. Besides, Crawford was a beautiful woman with a perfect figure. Who wouldn't want to look at a beautiful woman? Crawford quickly finished her bowl of broth and noticed David standing next to her, just staring at her. Suddenly, she felt a little embarrassed. "Aren't you eating?" she asked, then recalled David's earlier description of the camp. He was alone. And supplies were scarce. "Are you running low on food?" "No, I just finished eating before you got here," David explained. "I got lucky. I hunted a deer during the day." "That's good." Confirming she hadn't devoured their meager supplies, Crawford's worries eased somewhat. She then inquired about the village's surroundings. She wondered if there was anything special near the village, otherwise why would she have ended up there so suddenly? Perhaps finding the source of that mysterious power would allow her to return. David guessed what she was thinking, but he didn't tell her that a mysterious power was most likely himself. Instead, he simply described the surroundings. To the west of the village lay a vast river, its source probably originating from the mountain that could be vaguely seen to the north. The river flows from north to south, then turns west just west of their village. Another, much narrower river flows from south to north, joining it. This location was chosen for the camp largely because it's the point where the river turns and converges, offering ample fresh water and abundant fish, shrimp, and other aquatic products. The forests to the north are another factor, providing a plentiful supply of high-quality timber. Furthermore, the flat terrain, with plains to the east and south, is ideal for farmland. By all accounts, it was a good choice. However, the subsequent progress was far from what was anticipated. Crawford couldn't hear anything remarkable or unusual in David's description. "Haven't you encountered anything special in the past 2 years? The most special thing is your appearance?" Crawford felt frustrated by David's response. It seemed she needed to rethink her thinking. "Get a good night's rest. Even if you want to do anything, you'll have to wait until tomorrow morning." As they chatted, the sky had already darkened, and David needed to prepare for the coming night. Except for the cabin used as a warehouse and kitchen, the other 3 cabins have the same structure and layout: a large cabin with a place in the middle for making a fire, and simple beds placed around the fire. David spent the previous 2 years in such a simple environment during the winter. According to the pioneer's plan, this simple cabin was only a temporary residence, but they were unable to reclaim farmland, so no one was in the mood to build their own cabins. As a result, there are only a few temporary cabins here. Such cabins have poor insulation, and if you want to spend the night peacefully, you need to make a fire. David is now moving the necessary firewood in. Crawford was also helping, but when the two were carrying firewood, they almost simultaneously noticed a vague shadow appearing in an open space not far outside the village. Is this another one? Chapter 3. Another Buddha passed by. Crawford watched as a translucent figure, initially only a blurry shape, gradually became clearer and more real. He finally gained a more direct understanding of the situation David had described. It was no wonder David had such a strange reaction. While Crawford focused on the figure's gradual realization, David carefully studied the newcomer, trying to identify him. He was disappointed. When the man finally revealed his true form, David couldn't immediately identify the middle-aged man with a strong, bearded appearance. As David and Crawford were studying each other, the middle-aged man also noticed them. He paused, as if sensing something, and surveyed his surroundings with a wary expression. "Excuse me, what is this place?" the middle-aged man asked in a language David had never heard before. But David found he could understand him and even figured out how to answer the question in this unfamiliar language the instant he heard it. He paused for a moment, pondering the matter in his mind. He quickly realized that his newly mastered language was also called common, but it wasn't the same as the common language used by humans in this world. As for his sudden mastery of a new language, he suspected that Crawford's original reward wasn't simply English knowledge, but rather some more powerful ability. Hello, this is the pioneer camp in the northern part of the Kingdom of Tiran. I'm David, the village chief. How can I help you? David answered in his newly learned common, much to Crawford's surprise. Crawford possessed a gift for languages comparable to a genius. She had heard David speak common before, but the language he was speaking was clearly two completely different languages. The burly man across from him, upon hearing David's response, looked perplexed. Tiran Kingdom. After a few seconds of thought, he pressed on. How far is it from here to East Wilder? I don't know where East Wilder is. David shook his head, indicating he hadn't heard of the place. He wondered if the person who had inexplicably arrived wasn't necessarily someone he knew. The other party's enthusiasm had already lowered the burly man's guard, but David's response only deepened his confusion. Strathalm? The Kingdom of Lordran? Ever heard of those names? David remained silent, but inwardly, he was surprised. He was very familiar with the two place names, but it was inconvenient to directly acknowledge them. Meanwhile, he was mentally speculating on the identity of the man before him. Seeing David remain silent, the burly man's thick brows furrowed even more. He decided to introduce himself before asking for more information. Hello, my name is Old Buddha. I might be lost. I might need to stay in your village for the night. As one of Azeroth's most renowned paladins, he was no stranger to mystical powers and suspected he might have experienced some kind of spatial displacement. He wondered where he had been transported. Judging from the young man's reaction, he had most likely left the Eastern Kingdoms. Old Buddha pondered the strange events that had befallen him, while David was internally astonished by the identity of the burly man before him. He hadn't expected this renowned paladin to visit him. Recalling all the information he had about the old Buddha, David silently composed his words, preparing to directly tell the paladin before him the truth. Some things didn't need to be concealed, and the other party wasn't stupid. Even if David didn't say anything, the old Buddha would quickly notice something was amiss. It would be better to directly share all the details, as a way to show his attitude and improve his favorability. If the old Buddha were willing to teach him how to use the holy light, David would be in luck. It wasn't that he was impressed by the holy light's immense power, but rather its remarkable ability to heal and dispel diseases. Living alone in this relatively backward world, David's biggest concern was not getting timely treatment for injuries and illnesses. Previously, there had been no solution, but now that the old Buddha had appeared before him, it would be foolish not to seize the opportunity. There's something I need to explain to you. Describing the old Buddha's miraculous appearance and the example of Crawford, who had also arrived from another world, David easily explained the situation clearly. Old Buddha was also quicker to learn than Crawford. Coming from a world constantly at war with aliens, he was much more open to the idea of another world than Crawford. This isn't Azeroth. Old Buddha scratched his slightly messy hair. He hadn't expected to stumble into another world after getting lost. No wonder this young man named David had never heard of the Kingdom of Lordaeron. But why do you know the common tongue of Azeroth? I don't know. I seem to have some strange ability. I suddenly understood the language after meeting you. After a while, David figured it out. Crawford could quickly learn a new language by tracing the fragmentary records on ancient ruins and stone tablets. The reward he had originally received from Crawford was likely an upgraded version of this ability, not the English he had initially suspected. This discovery delighted him greatly. Old Buddha's appearance also confirmed his theory about his cheat code. It had been activated after he became village chief. This meant that more people from various worlds would appear in the future. With this ability, he wouldn't have to worry about language anymore. David was overjoyed, and old Buddha didn't find David's explanation offensive, merely examining him for a few more seconds. As they chatted, darkness had already fallen. Old Buddha had noticed Crawford and David carrying firewood into the cabin and offered to help. The three of them quickly gathered enough firewood, built a fire, and gathered around it to chat. Crawford didn't speak the common language of Azeroth, and old Buddha didn't speak English, so David had to translate for them, but overall, it didn't affect their conversation. After chatting for a while, Crawford had completely convinced herself of her otherworldly existence. Old Buddha's appearance dispelled any remaining doubts. Her doubts, combined with a recent string of misfortunes, a shipwreck, a blow, a stab wound, a fall into a ravine, completely relaxed Crawford, who quickly fell asleep. David covered Crawford with another blanket and then returned to his own bed to continue chatting with Old Buddha. Old Buddha didn't recount his past achievements, simply explaining that he'd left home for some reason and was wondering where he'd stumbled upon this place. If you don't mind this place, you can stay in the village for a while. Listening to Old Buddha's description, David finally understood his current situation. In the Warcraft storyline, Old Buddha was exiled for a conflict with his subordinates and for helping in rescuing an orc. After wandering for a while, he chose to live in seclusion somewhere in East Wilder, a place that would later be renamed the Plaguelands due to the devastating plague. This was why David had previously said he hadn't heard of East Wilder. After so many years, such details had long since faded. That sounds like a good suggestion. Old Buddha didn't resist David's invitation. At the moment, he had no particular destination in mind, he was simply wandering around. He didn't immediately agree, simply because he couldn't leave his wife and son behind. Now, in another world, he couldn't help but wonder how to get back. After all, when he was exiled, he was still in Azeroth. He could sneak back to see his wife and children if he missed them. Now, in this situation, even if he wanted to go back, he wasn't sure if he could. Old Buddha stopped talking, and David sank into bed. The only sound in the cabin was the occasional crackle of the fire. His consciousness gradually faded, and when he regained consciousness, it was already dawn. David sat up. The fire nearby was still burning, but the firewood had run out. Clearly someone had been tending it all night. No wonder he slept through the night. It was impossible to sleep soundly when he was alone. Not only did he have to constantly get up to tend the fire, but he also had to be wary of wild beasts. Last night was different. With a powerful and virtuous paladin like Old Buddha by his side, he didn't have to worry about his safety. David hadn't felt so at ease in a long time. Just as he was wondering where Old Buddha had gone, the door to the cabin opened, letting in more sunlight, waking Crawford. First he sat up alertly, then he remembered his miraculous experience. Crawford forced a helpless smile, and said good morning to David. Good morning, David. Good morning, Crawford. The Old Buddha standing by the door saw that both of them were awake, and greeted them, and said something that surprised them. Good morning, both of you. I think I know how to return to my own world. What? Crawford was very excited when she understood what this sentence meant through David's translation. She was the one who most wanted to go back among the people present. How to do it? It's very simple. Just find a direction to walk out of the village, and think about returning to your own world in your heart. Chapter 4 Lao Fo decided to stay. Thinking of returning to your own world, just randomly walking out of the village, Crawford asked incredulously. So easy? Yes, Old Buddha nodded. I just tried it a few times, and it's really that simple. Having discovered a way to travel back and forth freely, Old Buddha felt a great deal more relaxed. He didn't have anything urgent to do anyway. As long as he could go back when he missed his wife and children, it didn't matter where he went, even if it was another world. As for whether this world would pose a threat to Azeroth, he hadn't seen any such possibility yet. Perhaps he could stay and observe for a while. David hadn't known Old Buddha had considered settling in his place. Although it was a bit of a surveillance, he wouldn't have cared if he knew. Azeroth, as the main character of that world, was subject to various invasions, so it was not surprising that those living there would be concerned about this issue. For this reason, David had no interest in Azeroth. That world was too chaotic. Even if he had the power to invade other worlds, he wouldn't choose it. Besides, he didn't have the ability to travel to other worlds. So how do I get back? While Crawford was more concerned with returning to his own world, David was curious about another question. How did Old Buddha get back here after returning? Same thing. Just think about coming to your place, and you'll get here. David was speechless at the simple thought. Just walk in any direction, easier. You can even just stand still. Old Buddha's bearded, imposing face held a hint of amusement. He'd just tried it casually, and he hadn't expected it to work. Listening to Old Buddha's subsequent narration, David understood that for those who had come to his place, simply thinking of his place and making the gesture of walking would get them back, much simpler than returning to their own world. On the other hand, to leave, they had to walk out of the village, in any direction, simply circling within wouldn't work. I'll give it a try. After listening to Old Buddha's explanation, Crawford, not even in the mood for breakfast, immediately left the cabin and headed in a random direction. David quickly followed him outside, then stood at the door, watching Crawford run off into the distance. He wanted to see what Crawford looked like as he left. He didn't have to wait long. He soon saw Crawford's figure become translucent, appearing and disappearing before gradually fading, essentially the reverse of how they had appeared. So this is what it's like when you leave. It was a first for old Buddha, since he couldn't see how he appeared or left. What did you feel when you left? David was curious. What did Crawford and old Buddha feel like in this seemingly ethereal state? The answer was completely different from what he had imagined. Nothing. I was just walking, and in a flash, I was somewhere else. This spatial shift was seamless, like he took a step forward, and the next second, the surroundings were completely transformed. Just then, Crawford reappeared outside the village, still a vague figure, gradually becoming clearer, finally revealing himself. It's amazing, much like old Buddha, after realizing he could travel back and forth freely, Crawford stopped dwelling on his inability to return and instead became filled with curiosity about this strange phenomenon, eager to understand what was going on. What caused it all? Perhaps something with mysterious powers was hidden near this village, like ancient ruins or an altar. However, she remembered she had companions, and perhaps she should wait until she reunited with them and rescuers took them off the island before she could investigate this issue. With her worries gone, Crawford naturally became preoccupied with other issues. She was hungry. It wasn't just Crawford who was hungry, old Buddha was also hungry. However, as a guest, he felt embarrassed to rummage around for food. Moreover, he wasn't sure if this seemingly simple village had enough food. After all, as a powerful paladin, he had a huge appetite. After thinking for a moment, old Buddha suggested, should we go around and see if there was any prey? No need. There's still some venison I hunted yesterday in the kitchen, enough for the three of us. It was a whole deer. He and Crawford hadn't eaten much yesterday, so with old Buddha's meat, it would be more than enough for breakfast. David led the two to a wooden barrel of clean water, where he retrieved a basin and several clean towels for them to wash. Then, the three of them prepared a hearty breakfast, roasted venison and a small portion of waffle mixed with wild vegetables in a soup. All three enjoyed the meal with great joy. David was motivated to continue his efforts, building the village, welcoming more people from various worlds, gaining rewards from them, and learning special abilities like the Holy Light. Crawford knew how to return, and with David's help, she could easily seek help if she encountered trouble. She wondered if she could bring her companions with her. She was also curious about this strange and mysterious world and decided to return here to explore its truth once it was safe. Old Ford thought this place would be a good retreat. No one knew him, and he could live a peaceful and stable life there, always able to visit his wife and children whenever he missed them. After breakfast, Crawford announced his departure, saying he needed to reunite with his companions and find a way to contact rescuers. Take this. Hearing Crawford prepare to depart, David retrieved his spare bow, a quiver of arrows, and a short knife, handing them to Crawford. You've been attacked by monsters before. That island seems unsafe. Bringing a weapon will help protect you. He tucked the sheathed short knife into his waist, slung the quiver across his back, and, holding the bow, gave David a warm hug. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here and to have met you. Ah, you're welcome. Initially enjoying himself, David hunched over slightly, but didn't intend to push Crawford away. He wished the hug had lasted longer. A faint blush tinged his neck. Crawford said nothing more. He released David, bow in hand, and turned to leave the village. David remained motionless, taking a moment to straighten his back. He then saw old Buddha looking at him with a smile. What? Nothing. You said earlier that you welcome me to stay here permanently. Was that just a polite remark, or were you serious? Of course I'm welcome. David was delighted to hear that. He desperately wanted old Buddha to stay. Only by spending more time together could he learn from the Paladin all the knowledge of the Holy Light. Even putting aside the Holy Light knowledge, David needed a sufficient population to develop the pioneer camp into a full-fledged village within the Kingdom of Tiran. The barren land, harsh climate, and remote location made it difficult to attract farmers to settle here. But with a different approach, David could easily attract people from other worlds, like old Buddha, who sought seclusion. Please take good care of me in the future, village chief. David extended his hand and shook old Buddha's. He felt as if something had changed within him, but upon closer inspection, he couldn't detect anything. Illusion. Putting that aside, David gave old Buddha a brief overview of the village. There wasn't much to say. 4 temporary wooden huts, 3 of which were for living, all identical in structure. One served as a warehouse, kitchen, and blacksmith shop. To the west of the village lies a large river, rich in aquatic resources. To the north lies a forest, teeming with wild vegetables, fruits, and wild animals. David has yet to venture deep into the forest, merely circling its periphery, so he has no idea how dangerous it truly is. The east and south are plains, but if you follow the riverbank south, you'll reach the Ironwood Forest. The Ironwood Forest, located northwest of Ironwood Castle, is an immense expanse, named for the ironwood, a premium timber. It's the barrier between the Ironwood Forest and the Tilan Mountains that has long prevented the Tilan Kingdom from conquering this vast plain. David's pioneer camp is quite far from Ironwood Castle, arguably the northernmost region of the Tilan Kingdom, if he can even establish a village. It's just you and me in the village now. While we lack crops to grow, we can get enough food by hunting and fishing. After outlining the situation, David then shared his plans. If we want to stay here longer, we need to build new wooden houses. Old Buddha agreed. He had been suggesting that David build a few better houses. There's a forest not far away, so there's no shortage of wood. While stone houses were better, old Buddha wasn't a stonemason, so while he might be able to build a wooden house, he had no idea how to build a stone one. There are some tools at the blacksmith shop. Although the blacksmith had taken many tools with him when he left, a lot had been left behind, enough for David and old Buddha. As they chatted, they gathered their tools and prepared to head into the forest. David, reaching for his bow and arrow, noticed that his grip felt different than before. He took an arrow, knocked it onto the bowstring, and drew his bowstring, aiming. What's wrong? Nothing. In a split second, David was certain he had received another reward from Crawford, at some unknown time. Why was he so sure it was from Crawford? Because the Paladin, old Buddha, doesn't seem to have much to do with bows and arrows, and Crawford's primary weapon in the storyline is a bow and arrow. Speaking of which, the strange feeling I had shaking hands with old Buddha earlier might not have been an illusion. I wonder what reward he gave me. Chapter 5 Superb Archery Talent. There was no way to be sure yet. David internally complained about his cheat code, how unclear it was, and how much effort he had to put into figuring it out. Wouldn't it be much better to just have a system? No need for complexity, even just a simple prompt interface would be fine, clear and straightforward. The cheat code isn't great. Arriving at the edge of the forest with old Buddha, David gazed at the towering trees before him and set his thoughts to rest. He could figure out cheat codes and rewards later when he had time, but for now, he should focus on building a house. These are all top-quality woods, old Buddha observed carefully, confirming they were perfect for building a house. After all, he was a paladin who had led armies against orcs and commanded his men to cut down trees for camps, so he had some foresight. Next, we'll cut down the trees. It was no easy task. They not only had to fell each tree, but also clear the branches from the trunks, and then carry the entire, thick log back to the village. While the village wasn't far from the forest, it was still a distance away. David, looking at the thick tree trunks, wondered if he could even lift them. "Oh, I forgot to ask you something," old Buddha said, still surveying the surroundings. He saw the trees were incredibly sturdy, and the forest was so vast he couldn't see the end. This meant they didn't have to worry about having enough wood. "What's the matter? What's the name of our village?" David was stunned by the question. He had never considered it. Although the pioneer camp had been established for nearly 2 years, due to the uneven progress and the dwindling number of members, it had never become a full-fledged village, and thus, no official name had been chosen. Because of various issues, we haven't had a formal name yet. After answering old Buddha's question, David began to think about what name to give the village. He hadn't thought about it before, and at that time, he had almost given up. But now that he had decided to persevere and had a direction for development, he needed to decide on a name as soon as possible. Not only was it convenient for future visitors, but the official village name was also required for the pioneering certificate, making it easier to report to the kingdom authorities and receive various rewards. Is that so? Old Buddha had already chosen a large tree and swung his axe to begin felling. Then you'd better give it a good name. I'll think carefully about it. David also grabbed his axe and prepared to start chopping, but after a few strokes, he realized the huge gap between his efficiency and old Buddha's. His current physical condition was not bad, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to survive 2 winters. As a hunter, He had always had plenty of meat, and with years of training, he was much stronger now than in his previous life. But compared to old Buddha, a Titan-born iron creature from Azeroth who had degenerated into human and been baptized by the holy light, he was a complete wimp. After old Buddha finished chopping down a tree, he cleared away the branches and leaves, while David was still struggling with the first trunk. By the way, the village's food supply isn't running low. I think we should gather and store more. Old Buddha noticed David's physical fitness was far inferior to his own, but he waited until David had felled the first tree before offering his suggestion. Huh? David knew old Buddha meant well. The difference in their efficiency was too significant. They thought it would be better to split up and do different tasks, to maintain a consistent pace while ensuring food supply. Then I'll leave this to you, don't worry, this kind of work is easy for me. Old Buddha, once a respected figure, had no objection to the rough work of felling trees. Having decided to live a relatively ordinary life of seclusion, he could no longer consider himself the Lord of Hearthglen and Lordaeron. Now, old Buddha was just an ordinary farmer, ready to build a new life with his own hands. This thought made felling trees seem less tedious, and even more motivated, bringing down trees at a faster pace. David, separated from old Buddha, moved westward along the edge of the forest. Following the river in this direction, walking along the forest's edge to the riverbank and then following it northward would ensure he didn't get lost and would also make it easier to spot large animals. This route wasn't entirely safe, so David kept his left hand on his hunting bow, his right hand perched on the quiver hanging at his side, ready to draw his arrows and strike. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of a passing shadow. He instantly snatched up an arrow, knocking it and aiming in record time. In that instant, David felt as if everything in his vision slowed down, while the vague shadow suddenly became clearer, even magnified, allowing him to see even more clearly. Furthermore, a feeling dawned on him that he needed to move a few centimeters to the left to find the correct crosshair. His thumb released the bowstring, and as the arrow swam towards its target, David felt certain it would hit the target, with no need for a follow-up strike. Everything that happened next was just as he'd imagined. The arrow accurately struck a pheasant, swiftly and decisively taking its life. From the moment David drew the arrow to the moment the pheasant was struck and killed, it took only the blink of an eye. Wow, my archery skills have improved quite a bit. Even though he'd suspected he'd gained archery skills from Crawford, he hadn't expected such a dramatic improvement. Besides being surprised, he realized something else. It seems my archery talent wasn't particularly strong to begin with. The gap between me and a master who could rip through an entire organization with a single bow and arrow is enormous. I thought I could become a hunter. I have some archery talent. Then he thought again, even if his talent wasn't great, with people like Crawford and old Buddha constantly appearing to help him improve, his future was quite bright. Retrieving the arrow and hanging the pheasant from his left waist, David prepared to continue foraging. Besides meat, he also wanted to find wild vegetables, mushrooms, and fruits, ensuring a diverse diet for a healthier life. While meat is delicious, no one can handle eating only meat. He was lucky enough to pick some mushrooms and berries. Even though picking the berries required crouching down and picking them one by one, he didn't feel the slightest bit of impatience, only a burst of joy. Just as he was happily picking berries, he suddenly sensed something was wrong and reacted instantly. Dropping his handful of berries, he dove to the side, picking up his hunting bow and rolling to his feet. Though his body was covered in dirt and grass, looking disheveled, he perfectly avoided the beast's attack, a massive gray wolf. Seeing the beast clearly, David immediately glanced around. Sure enough, he spotted more gray wolves in the bushes and behind trees. Slowly shifting his position, David moved toward the river to avoid being attacked from both sides. The wolf seemed to sense his intention and pounced again while David was still moving slowly. The hungry wolf was met with a barrage of arrows, almost simultaneously fired. David, after years as a hunter, couldn't say he didn't have any unique skills. He was a master of rapid fire, able to gather 3 to 5 arrows at once and fire them all in record time, ensuring they all landed within a circle roughly the size of a human head. Now, with the added bonus of Crawford's archery skills, he could even reduce that range to a fist-sized circle. The sense of slow motion surrounding his concentrated aim meant David could better lock onto and kill his target, even at high speed. He easily dispatched the first enemy, but now was no time to relax. David immediately drew 2 arrows from his quiver, this time aiming from 2 different directions. His intense concentration and slow-motion vision gave his brain ample time to make decisions. The wolf on his left had already leaped and poised to strike, while the wolf on his right was still sprinting and gathering momentum, further away. While this state didn't allow David to move faster physically, it allowed him to make the best decisions in a split second to secure the kill, left first, then right. The two arrows fired in quick succession. While not a fatal strike, they halted the wolves' charge, buying David a moment. In a mere second or two, several more arrows flew in, piercing both wolves and completing the kill. David moved with remarkable agility. Instead of retreating, he charged forward, swiping the arrow from the wolf he'd killed first. He then fired again, killing another wolf. Having completed his consecutive kills, David reached for his arrow, but by the time he could draw his bow again, the wolves had already turned and dived into the forest, disappearing without a trace. How fast? His tense mind relaxed slightly, and David observed his surroundings warily. He then gathered the scattered berries, tied the wolf carcasses together, and carried them on his back. Then, cautiously, he made his way back along the riverbank. "Thanks, Crawford." After confirming the wolves hadn't caught up, David breathed a sigh of relief and thanked Crawford again for providing him with his exceptional archery abilities. He also looked forward to the various magical rewards offered by Old Buddha and even those who would appear in the future. Chapter 6 Holy Light. Returning to the site of the previous felling, carrying a large harvest, he found Old Buddha still busy at work, but several logs of simply treated wood were already spread out around him. He also gathered the branches and leaves he had cleared, which would make excellent firewood and be carried back to the village. "You're back." Old Buddha stripped off his shirt, revealing his powerful muscles. "You look like you've been in trouble." David, carrying the carcasses of several gray wolves, was covered in dirt and grass, clearly having encountered a pack and engaged in a fierce battle. Heaving his axe over his shoulder, Old Buddha examined David carefully. "Are you hurt?" "I'm lucky, I'm not hurt." If he hadn't been lucky enough to obtain the golden finger, and thus, Crawford's archery talent, with his original strength, he would have certainly been injured, or even killed. "Oh," Old Buddha exclaimed in surprise. Given David's physique, he hadn't been injured in the encounter with a wolf pack, and he'd even killed several. David's archery skills were impressive, the wounds on the wolf carcasses were obvious, and each wolf had more than one wound. Hitting multiple targets with multiple arrows required both accuracy and speed. It made sense. Without some skill, David wouldn't have been able to survive in this place, let alone become the last person to establish the camp. But the coming days will be troublesome. Although David's strength had greatly increased, and Old Buddha was a powerful paladin, he wasn't worried about a direct confrontation with the wolves. The wolves' retaliation often came in the form of relentless sneak attacks, day and night. Even if the two could handle it, the constant harassment would be irritating. Old Buddha knew the habits of wolves. They existed in Azeroth as well. It's certainly a problem, but the powerful Old Buddha wasn't worried. If the wolves thought they could sneak up on him while he was chopping trees, they were seriously mistaken. Even if Old Buddha stood there and let the gray wolf bite him first, he wouldn't be the one to fall. David, on the other hand, though skilled with a bow, had average physical prowess. A sudden attack would put him in danger. With this in mind, Old Buddha offered a suggestion that delighted David. "I possess a special power that will allow you to better handle any situation. If you're interested, I can teach you how to harness it. If you can learn to use it, you won't have to worry about the gray wolves in the forest." David's earlier remarks hadn't been without some intention of steering the conversation toward the holy light. His initial plan was to introduce the topic, then, once Old Buddha mentioned the power, express his desire to learn it. He didn't think Old Buddha would refuse, as the Church of the Light was a very open-minded sect led by Archbishop Alonsis Faol. Its priests had been diligently spreading the light's ways throughout Azeroth. Essentially, if you were willing to learn, they were willing to teach. Before becoming a paladin, Old Buddha was also a priest in the Church of the Holy Light. Spreading its teachings and educating believers about the Holy Light had always been his job. Given this situation, when David expressed his desire to learn the Holy Light, Old Buddha was unlikely to refuse. Unexpectedly, things went even more smoothly than David had anticipated, with Old Buddha offering to teach David the Holy Light. "Oh? What kind of power is that?" "It's a righteous force imbued with warmth and light. It can heal wounds, cure disease, and fight evil. Of course, it can even deal with ordinary beasts. Holy light is one of the fundamental elements of Azeroth, but that doesn't mean it disappears outside that world. After all, Many worlds share this fundamental element. This energy generally possesses positive and constructive properties, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's righteous. David was well aware of that. But he wasn't about to debate old Buddha about what holy light actually was. He quietly became a holy light novice, listening to old Buddha describe its wonders, interspersed with the teachings of the Church of the Holy Light. Through old Buddha's explanation, David learned that the Church of the Light is a group that encourages goodness and a positive outlook on life. Its priests diligently assist those facing various challenges, from small matters like resolving family disputes to larger ones like fighting bandits and bullies, and even combating the evil forces that threaten the world. Because steadfast acts of kindness easily earn the light's approval and lead to mastering its miraculous power, during this period in Azeroth, light users, followers, were equated with bringers of justice. After all this, you should have a basic understanding of the light, old Buddha explained. His main goal was to ensure David had a solid understanding of the light before he could truly teach. After explaining the method to awaken the light, old Buddha again expressed uncertainty. But I'm not sure you can achieve it. You want to try now, since they were not in Azeroth, and he didn't know how far this world was from Azeroth. He was truly unsure whether David could master the light. He had several theories about David's learning of the holy light, that David had diligently studied and gradually comprehended it, that David, despite his efforts, had never been able to comprehend it, or that David possessed extraordinary talent and had quickly comprehended it. In any case, he didn't believe David's current attempt would yield any results. But as David knelt on one knee, his back straight, his hands resting on his knee in front of him, and his eyes closed, concentrating on comprehending the holy light, something he had never anticipated occurred. A golden light gradually emanated from David's body, initially barely perceptible, then gradually becoming clearer and brighter, and soon he was engulfed in the golden glow. As a paladin, this glow was all too familiar to him. How is this possible? It wasn't just that David had mastered the holy light on his first attempt. What exactly did this scene mean? Had David comprehended the holy light, leading to its baptism? But this phenomenon was completely different from what he was familiar with, whether it was a paladin or a priest. Upon realizing the holy light, a pillar of light descended from the void. The priest or paladin bathed in the holy light was baptized by it and became a follower of the light. However, the holy light before him didn't descend from the void, but emanated from David's body. Though it was still faint and powerless, old Buddha couldn't mistake it. Old Buddha, overwhelmed with questions, couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation for the scene before him. Could David before him actually be the holy light incarnate? Holy light, is this a test for me? Old Buddha seriously suspected that his haphazard arrival in this world and his encounter with such a unique being as David was actually the holy light testing him, testing his faith in the light to see if it was strong enough. David, with his eyes closed, was unaware that old Buddha was stunned, still immersed in the joy of having mastered the miraculous power of the holy light. David, unaware of the uniqueness of his situation, immediately felt a surge of holy light within him after closing his eyes and following the instructions of the old Buddha. It felt like a hot spring bubbling up from deep within him. This warmth then slowly flowed through his body, washing everything it passed through, leaving him feeling incredibly comfortable. This feeling is even better than a bath or a massage. Not only did his fatigue vanish, David felt as if his body had been reborn. All the discomfort left by the past 2 years vanished, and even his strength seemed to increase. His mind became clearer, his spirits invigorated. These changes left David enjoying them for a while before he reopened his eyes. Old Buddha, what's wrong with you? No, nothing. Old Buddha didn't mention David's abnormality. He felt he now had even more reason to settle here. I just didn't expect you to comprehend the holy light so quickly. Few can do that. This response wasn't a perfunctory one. The Church of the Holy Light had many priests, and the Silver Hand had trained a number of paladins, but the vast majority required rigorous instruction and training before they could comprehend the holy light. Only a very few could instantly gain its favor the moment they chose to embark on the path of the holy light. Really? It seems I have a pretty good talent in this area. As he spoke, David immediately realized what the reward he had received from old Buddha was, a gift for the holy light. He was self-aware. He didn't believe that the power countless heroes in the world of Azeroth could master instantly after just a few words from old Buddha was the only reasonable explanation. His cheat code had paid off. This is more than just good, the old Buddha sighed. He did not rush to teach David how to use the power of holy light. Instead, he carefully asked David about his feelings, such as whether he had any special feelings after comprehending the holy light. I feel that some of the minor ailments in my body have disappeared. It seems that my strength has also increased. It seems that my spirit has become better. Listening to David's description, the old Buddha was roughly certain that David had mastered the holy light. Except for the slight difference in the scene he just saw, there was no difference between it and the holy light he used. Not only that, because of the protection of the holy light, you can carry out more rigorous physical training, which will greatly improve your physical fitness. There was no abnormality for the time being, and the old Buddha was ready to teach David how to use the holy light according to the normal process. As for whether to focus on the application of the holy light, or to hone your body and learn the use of various weapons, it depends on your personal interest. Chapter 7. Let me give you a buff first. While carrying firewood and lumber, David listened to old Buddha explain the cultivation of the holy light. He understood that both paladins and priests were simply followers of the holy light. While there were slight differences in their use of the light, they weren't as clearly defined as in-game. The real world of Azeroth didn't have the complex skills and talents of the game. To some extent, the power and nature of the holy light were inherent. As long as you were willing to cultivate, develop, and practice, even a paladin could master the skills of a priest. The same was true in reverse. So old Buddha was saying that David should choose his own path based on his interests, not that he had to choose one and then be set. So, which path are you interested in? I'm interested in all of them. David was an adult, no longer a child, so he wanted to learn all of them. Since there's nothing important to do here, I have plenty of time to learn all about the holy light. Ultimately, it all came down to understanding and applying the holy light, improving one's physical fitness, and mastering various weapons. Those were the three main areas, so why not just learn them all when he had nothing else to do? That's no problem. For old Buddha, David's desire to learn everything was no problem. Before becoming a paladin, he had been a cleric. Of the first 5 paladins of Azeroth, with the exception of Gravinor Doom, who is a knight of the Order of the Stormwind, the other 4 were all clerics of the Church of the Holy Light. Considering David's current physical condition, old Buddha suggested that before improving his physique, David shouldn't rush into cold weapons like the sledgehammer or two-handed bastard. Instead, he should prioritize learning how to properly use holy light for healing, and self-defense, thereby better ensuring his safety. As for offensive holy light spells, David didn't need to learn them for now. His archery skills were more than enough for most situations. For the rest of the day, the two of them traveled back and forth between the village and the forest, teaching David the basics of holy light. David learned quickly, and after a few attempts, he almost immediately mastered the use of holy light for healing and defense. After several rounds of sprinting, his stamina was depleted, so old Buddha instructed David how to use holy light to recover when his stamina was depleted. Just like when he had sensed the holy light, he knelt on one knee with his hands on his knee. This time, the old Buddha saw that the holy light emanating from David wasn't emanating from within. Like most ordinary followers of the holy light, a pillar of light descended from above, enveloping David's entire body. After standing there observing for a moment, the old Buddha stopped watching. While it was still early, he decided to quickly transport the wood back. As the old Buddha carried the wood back and forth, David felt this warm energy constantly flowing through his body. Almost every flow alleviated the discomfort in that part of his body. As time passed, he felt a warmth within him grow stronger. He realized that this prayer-like state not only restored his body to optimal condition, but also made the holy light within him even more powerful. This must be the meditation method used by holy light users, right? He speculated in his mind and reopened his eyes. As David awakened, the pillar of light enveloping him slowly dissipated, like a golden rain of light, slowly falling and gradually disappearing. At that moment, old Buddha had just brought back the last piece of wood. "Oh, you're awake? How is it feeling?" "Best ever." David clenched his fist slightly, feeling his strength increase again. Was it an illusion? He remembered what old Buddha had said before, users of holy light can freely sharpen and train their bodies without worrying about harm. Perhaps it wasn't an illusion? Just as David was about to inquire more about the holy light, he saw a vague figure appear outside the village. "Someone's coming." Old Buddha was piling the long logs together. Upon hearing David's words, he followed his gaze and noticed a figure outside the village. "Is it Crawford?" "I don't know." It was impossible to tell who the person was until the figure solidified and revealed its features. This was a headache for David. What if it was someone unpleasant, or even a supervillain? What if he was unpleasant, or even a supervillain? Fortunately, the two people who had appeared so far were completely decent. Perhaps his cheat code had some kind of filtering function? As he was speculating, the figure outside the village revealed its true form. It wasn't a newcomer, but Crawford, whom they both knew. "Crawford, what's wrong with you?" Crawford looked ill, her body smeared with mud and water, looking rather disheveled. Her hands were tied behind her back, and a look of panic filled her face. "David, help me." Crawford cautiously ran to David, her hands behind her back. Seeing that David had already drawn a dagger from his waist, she immediately turned around and offered her bound hands to David. David carefully cut the ropes, allowing Crawford to turn back to him before continuing to ask, what happened? So much time had passed since his previous life, and he could only remember Crawford and the general plot, not all the details. Seeing Crawford's hands bound in person, he gradually recalled some details. "After my companions and I finally reunited, we encountered some strange creatures." Crawford took a few deep breaths to calm herself, and then described the situation in the simplest terms. As David listened, the corresponding images flashed through his mind. These memories, buried deep in his mind, could be recalled with the triggering of the key words. "Don't panic. Let's figure out what to do first." After listening to Crawford's description, David understood her current situation. This was Crawford's first encounter with a true enemy, so it was no wonder she had been so flustered. In the original story, Crawford wouldn't have grown so quickly in just a few days unless she was pushed into a desperate situation. But now, with David and his village as her special place, Crawford had a retreat and someone to turn to, so she didn't immediately choose to confront the Brotherhood of the Sun. Upon learning of Crawford's plight, old Buddha immediately offered to help. To the Paladin, they were just a bunch of bandits, not a big deal. But things weren't that simple. After 2 simple attempts, old Buddha and David were certain there was no way they could reach Crawford's world. Even when Crawford tried to carry David on his back, he ended up falling to the ground as Crawford's figure turned translucent. What should I do? After several attempts, Crawford finally realized that neither David nor old Buddha could help her. She was on her own. With no escape route, Crawford's inner strength gradually awakened. She glanced at David's bow and arrows, suggesting she needed to borrow them. "Those guys took mine. Can I use yours?" "Of course." Looking at Crawford, her face filled with determination, the familiar archaeologist seemed to be taking shape. "Besides, I can help you with a few things. Oh, you see, you can come and go as you please, which means you can always escape danger." David suddenly felt strangely like he had become a safe zone, providing food, water, and even equipment. Some of the irrationalities in the game seemed to make sense. Suppressing the strange feeling of being some kind of NPC, David continued, "Besides, I just learned some very useful skills from old Buddha." Hearing David's words, "You can always escape danger," Crawford felt more reassured. Unexpectedly, David's next words shocked her even more. "Even if you're injured, as long as it's not fatal, old Buddha and I can heal you." Just as she was about to ask for more clarification, David had already raised his hand and placed it on Crawford's shoulder. As a golden light shone from David's hand, Crawford, who was still suffering from various minor injuries, felt a warm current flowing from David's hand into her body. As the warmth flowed through her body, all the discomfort in her body disappeared. What happened? Crawford lowered her head to examine herself. Not only had the scratches on her arm disappeared, but after removing the bandages from her waist, her face was filled with disbelief. The penetrating wound in her waist had healed, without even a scar left. "What did you do?" "Old Buddha just taught me a power called Holy Light." "Incredible, isn't it?" David showed off like a child with a new toy. "How magical." Looking up at the light flickering in David's palm, Crawford felt that there were more and more things here that were beyond her imagination. At the same time, she did not ignore the content revealed in David's words. This power was taught to David by the old Buddha, which means that it was the power of the old Buddha's world. Before she could even ask the old Buddha if she could learn this power, David gave her a new surprise. "Not only can it heal, this power can also protect you from harm." David, like a peacock spreading its tail, raised his hand and infused Crawford with a large amount of holy light. This holy light would form a layer of shield on Crawford's body, protecting Crawford from external harm. In addition, the energy of the holy light could also allow Crawford to maintain sufficient physical strength for a certain period of time. With the protection of the holy light, you can easily rescue those companions who were captured. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 8 Village Name. After briefly explaining the effects of his spell on Crawford's face was filled with surprise and curiosity. He seemed almost eager to try it out, to see if this so-called holy light was truly as magical as it could be. As Crawford vanished again, David turned to look at old Buddha standing next to him. I might not get any rest tonight, the storyline for Crawford officially began. The next few days would be filled with continuous fighting, meaning Crawford could come for help at any moment. It's okay, I'm used to this kind of situation, old Buddha said nonchalantly. Just prepare some water and food, maybe some bandages and medicine. Water and food were obvious. Crawford would definitely need some food and fluids after all the fighting. But would medicine and bandages still be necessary? As long as Crawford could successfully reach David and old Buddha, no matter how many injuries he sustained, they would be healed in a short time by the holy light. After a few seconds of thought, David realized that the medicine and bandages weren't for Crawford, but for Crawford's companions. At this point, whether they came to him or left and returned to their original world, there was no way to bring anyone with them. Even if Crawford's companions were injured, they wouldn't be able to seek treatment from David and old Buddha, forcing them to rely on medication. I'll get all the medicines out first, so Crawford can take them with him when he needs them. Old Buddha prepared to fetch more water from the river, mentioning the village's current lack of a crucial facility, a well. David could only throw his hands up helplessly. Our village lacks so many things. It's not like we don't have anything, but we have absolutely nothing. Everything, including the well, remained only on the drawing board. He placed the wolf carcasses in the warehouse and briefly processed the berries. Then, David continued to prepare his venison for dinner. Once the venison, mushrooms, and a few berries were cooked in the pot, he returned to the wolf carcasses. By the time he finished his work, old Buddha had already made several trips back and forth between the village and the river, filling all the water containers. Afterward, they lit a bonfire in the cabin and watched David arrive carrying a pot full of stew. Eating the stew, listening to old Buddha continue his lectures on the lore of the holy light, and waiting for Crawford, who might arrive at any moment, this night was probably the most fulfilling David had experienced in the past 2 years. At first, he could chat with his friends at night, envisioning a bright future. But as time went on and living conditions worsened, his companions dwindled, and the few who remained lost their appetite for conversation. Every evening was the most difficult time, reaching its peak when David was left alone. Unexpectedly, it was at this moment that David's life turned around. Not only did he find new companions, but he also mastered various magical abilities. This was especially true of the lore of the holy light he was currently studying. In his previous life, he had only been able to experience it in games, but now he could experience and wield this magical power firsthand. You have a strong affinity with the holy light, a profound understanding of it, and rapid progress. After a brief moment of instruction, the old Buddha again marveled at David's talent. If David's progress continued at this pace, it wouldn't be long before he surpassed him in the light's attainments. If such words were told to anyone in Azeroth, they would likely be unconvinced. After all, the old Buddha was one of the original 5 paladins, and their mastery of the light had long been recognized by all sentient life. For such a powerful being to believe David would soon surpass him demonstrates the prodigious talent he possesses. On just the first day of studying the holy light, David already possessed mastery of its power. He also learned how to use it to heal, dispel diseases, protect himself and others, increase their own or other stamina, and directly attack. Learning so quickly, David gazed at the golden energy in his palm. Even knowing it was a cheat, he couldn't suppress a surge of pride. This rate of progress is more than just fast, the old Buddha praised David sincerely. In fact, most newly apprenticed priests probably don't understand the holy light as well as you do. In other words, in less than a day, David went from a complete novice in the holy light to a qualified novice priest. The rest is just persistent practice. The old Buddha wanted to say something, urging David not to become complacent and let his guard down, but he stopped himself. Besides wanting to gauge David's character, he also had Crawford's arrival. With more practice, you'll naturally gain more insights. David turned to look at Crawford, who had opened the door and walked in. He could clearly sense that the holy light he had previously bestowed upon Crawford had been depleted. Looks like it's going smoothly. Aside from the loss of holy light, Crawford showed no signs of damage, not even a speck of dust or dirt. A smile graced his face. Have you dealt with those bandits? Not completely, but we've finally dealt with the immediate crisis. Crawford placed her hunting bow and quiver beside David. This is the bow and arrow I borrowed from you. Besides the bow and arrow she placed beside David, Crawford also carried another bow and arrow slung across her back, a large bag in her other hand, and a pistol tucked into her waistband. Clearly, besides recovering the previously stolen weapons, she had also secured some additional loot. I came here mainly to leave these things with you. She set the bag down and explained the contents to David. This is a pistol, and these are bullets. A pistol is a weapon that fires this type of bullet. You must never point the muzzle, right here, at yourself. David listened to Crawford's instructions with an expression of "Oh, how amazing." By comparison, old Buddha, standing next to her, was far more dedicated. After understanding what it was through David's translation, he exclaimed heartfeltly, "What a fine musket." After explaining the various precautions, Crawford gathered enough ammunition and prepared to set out again. Before leaving, she cautiously asked, "Can you still use that spell you cast earlier?" Of course. Crawford's smile widened at David's response, and she felt more confident. Having experienced it firsthand, she realized that as long as she had David's holy light spell protecting her, she was fearless. After a quick sip of broth and some water, she watched David raise his hand and release a burst of golden light. The light then condensed on him for a moment before fading. A confident Crawford waved goodbye again, leaving with her head held high. Watching Crawford's departure, David casually observed a 2-second silence for the members of the Brotherhood of the Sun. Then, while fiddling with the firearms Crawford had retrieved, he chatted with old Buddha. The island where Crawford was stranded possesses a mysterious power that destroys any aircraft or ships that enter the surrounding waters, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Consequently, countless stranded survivors have been stranded there for countless years. These individuals are of all backgrounds, many armed, and even groups. Furthermore, the Japanese had stationed troops on the island during World War II, so there's no shortage of firearms and ammunition. The bag Crawford brought back contained only 3 pistols and bullets, no rifles. After tinkering with it for a while and figuring out how to operate it, David couldn't help but wonder, could he imbue the bullets with holy light when firing? What would the effect be? We'll try it tomorrow morning. As for now, Crawford had just left, so he wouldn't be back immediately. Sleep? He was so alert right now, it was impossible to fall asleep. Continue studying holy light knowledge? Old Buddha had just said that diligent practice was crucial. Perhaps it was difficult to grasp more advanced knowledge until he gained more insights. So, what else could he do? Suddenly, he remembered the topic from the day before, and it was a good time to bring it up. Old Buddha, what do you think would be a good name for the village? Old Buddha, fiddling with his pistol, paused for a moment when he heard David's question. I think the name of the village should be decided by you, right? In old Buddha's eyes, this village was David's territory, and the power of naming naturally rested with David. Whatever David wanted the village to be called, it would be called. Besides, you've lived here for a while, so you should have a few names in mind, right? Old Buddha guessed that it wasn't that David hadn't come up with a name, but rather that he didn't know which one to choose. I do have a few names in mind. David's words made old Buddha mutter to himself, as expected, and then he asked what they were. He could give David some suggestions. Nujia village, that sounds a bit strange, David muttered to himself. This is the center of the universe, but after thinking carefully, he felt that such a domineering name was not something he could use carelessly. Ivory Mountain, the old Buddha was stunned. The nearest mountain is the peak in the north, right? If we use this name, the village will be too far away from the mountain peak, right? Muai village, this sounds good. Seeing David suddenly silent, the old Buddha looked puzzled. What's wrong? What's wrong with this name? I suddenly feel that this name is not very auspicious. If he used this name, would he die suddenly and not even have descendants? Besides, David didn't really want to use these names. He just said a few village names casually to make his thoughts active, and then come up with a suitable name according to the characteristics of this place. Located in the north, it's freezing cold. I suddenly thought of a more unlucky name. Chapter 9 Visitors from Mars. Winter Village. After a few seconds of thought, David chose not to copy it directly, but to slightly alter it. This changed the meaning, presumably obviating the association with that unfortunate family. Winter Village? Sounds good. Based on your previous description, the name perfectly captures the characteristics of this place. Old Buddha had learned from David that this was a very cold region, with winters being particularly harsh. Since you agree, then let's call it that. David pulled out the pioneering order he always carried with him and wrote the name Winter Village on it. The large river next to it can be called the Winter River. David, taking the easy way out, also decided on the name for the river. After all, according to the kingdom's decrees, he had the authority to name the river. If two pioneering teams named the same river, the kingdom would decide which name would be the official one. David doubted that would happen this time. No pioneering group had ventured further north than theirs. As for the river that flows south to north from the Ironwood Forest and eventually joins the Winter River, it's possible it was named by another pioneering group. Watching David scribble a few words on a scroll and carefully put it away, old Buddha curiously inquired, "Does this make it a territory recognized by the Kingdom of Tiran?" No, David shook his head, indicating it wasn't that simple. To become a formal village, you must at least have stable housing, sustainable agricultural land, and a sufficient number of villagers. You also need to report to the department responsible for such matters with a reclamation order. Officials will then be dispatched to conduct an on-site inspection. Once they've verified the village's status, they'll compile all the necessary information, including a newly drawn map, into a file for submission. Finally, the village chief will be officially appointed. Only then will they be considered to have truly opened up new territory for the kingdom, becoming an officially recognized minor lord. So complicated, old Buddha hadn't expected the appointment of a village chief to be so cumbersome. Because the circumstances are special, right, those who establish a village with a development order aren't considered ordinary village chiefs. They have significant autonomy and even the right to expand and upgrade the village, unlike village chiefs within the kingdom. If they can expand the village and reach a sufficient population within a specified period, they can be directly promoted to town chief, and the land becomes their fiefdom. I see. Technically speaking, David is barely a minor lord, though not yet officially one. It was precisely for these advantages that David joined the development team. Initially, he hadn't imagined becoming village chief. He had hoped to earn a knighthood, thus escaping the commoner class. Now, his thinking was simple. Now that he had secured his position, he needed to maintain it. He had begun to consider how to develop the village. Currently, his greatest asset was his golden finger, which attracted people from all over the world. If he utilized it effectively, the current problems would be easily solved. For example, if the land is barren and crops struggle to survive, he could ask Crawford to acquire some hardy, high-yield crop seeds from her world. He could even ask her to procure fertilizers and other supplies to improve the soil. Alternatively, he could wait until his relationship with old Buddha improved and ask her to seek the Druid's help in obtaining special seeds to improve the soil. Even if neither of these options worked, David wasn't ready to give up on this place. If it couldn't be a food base, couldn't he find something else? As long as he could maintain the functioning of his gold finger, who knew a super genius would arrive one day, and building an industrial base would be quite interesting. I just wonder what kind of minerals are around here. After a moment of wandering thoughts, David drifted off to sleep. When he opened his eyes again, it was already dawn. He turned to look nearby. The fire was almost gone, and old Buddha was resting on his bed. The water, broth, weapons, and medicines beside him were untouched. It seemed that Crawford hadn't been there since he fell asleep last night. Rising from his bed, David added some firewood to the fire, getting it burning brightly again. He then hung the cauldron of broth over the campfire, ready for him to eat once he returned from washing up. Stepping out of the cabin, breathing in the cool air, David briefly stretched his body before fetching some water to wash up. By the time he finished, old Buddha had also risen and was stretching his limbs in front of the cabin, just as David had done before. However, old Buddha's movement seemed much more ferocious than David's. If you were struck by those sturdy arms, it would certainly not end well. What are your plans for today? After finishing his activities, old Buddha, wiping his face with water, asked David about his plans. Yesterday, David had chopped down a lot of wood, and David had hunted several gray wolves. They had plenty of food and wood. Perhaps they should consider building a house? Or maybe digging a well first. To build a well, you need stone, right? Old Buddha wasn't exactly sure how to make a well, but he had the impression that it did. The question of professional stonemasonry brought both the men to a standstill. Let's build a shelter first. With only 2 of them permanently residing in the village, fetching water from the river was merely a minor inconvenience, not a pressing issue. As for the house, if they couldn't quickly build a sturdy, warm structure, they'd be in for another hard winter. Just as David was considering whether to wait until Crawford had resolved this issue and returned home to England, then have her deliver cement, bricks, glass, and other building materials so they could immediately build a beautiful, comfortable house, that elusive figure appeared again. Crawford, David and Old Buddha's initial reaction was that Crawford had returned, but it didn't take long for them to realize their mistake. The figure gradually became clearer, and with their excellent eyesight, they could immediately see it wasn't Crawford, but a man. Looks like there's someone new. Old Buddha knew that since he only had Crawford before him, this stranger must have been the first one to appear. He carefully examined the newcomer. He was of average height and appearance, though his attire was a bit odd. He was looking around in bewilderment. He quickly noticed David and Old Buddha standing in front of the cabin and approached without hesitation. "Hello, may I ask where we are?" "Hello, this is Winter Village. I'm David, the village chief." David continued to study the newcomer. He looked familiar, but he couldn't immediately determine his identity. "Hello. I'm Mark Watney." Mark Watney extended his hand and shook David's, seemingly confirming something. He gave it a slightly firm squeeze, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Who is this?" "My name is Old Buddha." David acted as interpreter. "Hello." Mark shook Old Buddha's hand again, then turned to David and asked, "Winter Village, where's it?" "This is the northernmost region of the Kingdom of Tiran." "I know you want to know where Tiran is. I'll briefly explain everything." After explaining the situation to Mark Watney, the newcomer immediately fell into a sea of self-doubt. He wondered if he was mad or dreaming. Watching the man's reaction, David carefully recalled all he knew about Mark Watney. From his face, David recognized him as the protagonist of the film adaptation of The Martian. In the film, botanist Mark Watney, part of a Mars exploration mission, landed on Mars. However, in an accident, his teammates presumed him dead, and he was left alone on the red planet. The entire film tells the story of Mark Watney's struggle to survive in the harsh Martian environment and await rescue. David, observing the Mark Watney before him, confirmed that this wasn't the Mark who had struggled to survive on Mars for a while. Back then, Mark, emaciated and suffering from numerous illnesses due to malnutrition, was emaciated and suffering from numerous illnesses. Is this a joke? Or am I dreaming? If this is another world, why do you speak English? Mark rubbed his temple and kept asking, still unable to believe he had inexplicably arrived in another world. This language, called English, I just learned it recently. Someone who spoke English came to me before you. The idea of suddenly learning a new language sounded too incredible, but David's rewording made it easier to accept. Sure enough, with just this one explanation, Mark stopped dwelling on the language issue and continued to be astonished at how he had ended up in another world. But it doesn't seem so bad to me. Thinking about the predicament he was about to face, he felt that perhaps God was helping him, giving him a new lease on life. After figuring this out, Mark, optimistic by nature, stopped worrying. A smile returned to his face, and he solemnly reintroduced himself. Mark Watney, botanist, NASA astronaut, and before coming to you, I was working on Mars exploration. I've run into a little trouble and may need your help. David listened to Mark's introduction and guessed what Mark Watney was currently going through, the time he had just been forgotten on Mars. Can you tell me more about the trouble, if it's okay? I'd like to stay in your village for a while. Chapter 10 Wild Rewards. Stay for a while. David understood why Mark Watney asked. In the storyline, after being accidentally abandoned on Mars, he was left to live alone on this desolate planet. His motivation for survival was to wait for the next manned mission to Mars in 4 years. How to survive those 4 years was his biggest challenge. Not only could the living quarters survive without breaking down, and could the oxygen and water systems function properly for 4 years, but for Mark Watney, the biggest challenge at this point was food. The base had enough food for 6 astronauts for 68 days. Even with only Mark Watney, that amount would only last him 300 days, or 400 days with limited rations, still far short of 4 years. It was at this time, Mark, struggling to figure out how to grow enough food on Mars for 3 years, that he stumbled upon David's winter village. At that moment, Mark Watney saw a new hope. If what David said was true, and he could travel freely between the two worlds, Then he could live here while finding a way to reunite with the next group of astronauts arriving on Mars and return to Earth together. So, for David, what was wrong with taking Mark Watney in? Of course not. So David welcomed him directly. It's no big deal. Welcome to Winter Village. Besides, Mark Watney was a botanist. Perhaps he could help him solve his land problem? Or perhaps he could learn some botanical skills from him? Reaching out his hand and shaking Mark's, David welcomed him. He didn't feel like he'd suddenly learned anything. Perhaps his favorability wasn't high enough? David wasn't in a rush. If his judgment was correct, Mark Watney would have to stay with him for at least a few years. Whether it was botanical knowledge or anything else, he wasn't in a rush. At the very least, Mark Watney was a living being. He needed a certain number of villagers to become the official village chief. David's plan was to, once Crawford had secured high-yield crop seeds, solving his most basic farmland and food needs, before heading to Iron Tree Castle to recruit a group of villagers. If someone already lived there, it would undoubtedly be more persuasive, convincing more people to stay. So, even ignoring the benefits of the Goldfinger, he would welcome Mark Watney if he only stayed a few years. Mark Watney wasn't aware of these matters at the moment, and even if he did, he wouldn't care. As long as his survival crisis was urgently resolved, everything else was trivial. Upon hearing David's welcome, Mark was so excited that his mouth couldn't close. Perhaps it was hunger that made him confused, but he seemed to smell the aroma of meat. He soon realized it wasn't a hallucination, but rather a pot of broth waiting for him. Our winter village is located in the northernmost part of the kingdom. It's a newly established village, so we don't have anything fancy to offer. I hope you don't mind. Mark's smile widened as he looked at the steaming broth David placed before him. Of course not. Thank you very much for your hospitality. I'd love to be of some assistance if possible. Mark didn't want to be a freeloader, so he began to think about what he could do. He felt that while he didn't know how he came to this world and didn't know much about it, based on what he had observed so far, its civilization seemed relatively backward. He thought he could use some of its advanced knowledge to improve the village. While eating breakfast, Mark expressed his desire to visit Winter Village later, not just the interior of the 4 wooden houses, but also the surrounding area. Of course, David saw no reason to refuse. Old Buddha then suggested exploring the forest to the north. David knew Old Buddha was worried about the wolf pack that had attacked David before and wanted to see if he could completely eliminate the threat. Of course, he had no objection. Just as the group was enjoying breakfast and deciding what to do next, Crawford arrived again. As Mark Watney, holding a wooden bowl, witnessed a figure materialize from nowhere, the last vestiges of doubt in his heart largely vanished, leaving only the possibility of a bizarre dream. Hello, my name is Crawford. When Crawford introduced himself to Mark Watney, the Martian botanist's face took a strange look. After a few seconds, he finally said, Hello, my name is Mark Watney. No one present was stupid, and Old Buddha was the sharpest of them all. Although he didn't understand English yet, after the past 2 days, he had figured out that Crawford's words were a simple greeting and introduction. It was quite amusing that such a simple greeting could elicit such a reaction from Mark Watney. David understood Mark's reaction, but he remained completely innocent, watching the scene unfold as if he knew nothing. Crawford also realized something, but, having gained some experience, she hesitated to question. She had more important matters to attend to. After requesting some food and water and having David replenish his various buffs, she hurriedly left. Watching the golden light emanate from David's wave, Mark suddenly realized he had not only entered another world but had also witnessed a mysterious power once only imagined in fantasy works. What is this, holy light? The name sounded so familiar, and Mark Watney suddenly felt the possibility that he was dreaming grew a little stronger. Watching David deftly put away the pots and pans, Mark followed behind, observing everything carefully, occasionally twisting his arms and thighs. Try as he might, the pain wouldn't wake him. And if he truly was dreaming, the details were far too detailed and realistic. Wait, as Mark followed David around the village, he seemed to have discovered something and called out to David, who was about to lead him to the river. I think I saw something. What? David was stunned. He turned and saw Mark rushing behind a wooden house. Is it a wild animal? Because the surrounding environment was not safe, David kept his weapon at hand even when he was resting, let alone during his daily activities. He reached out to take off his hunting bow, but heard Mark say, No, I think I saw potato sprouts. Huh? His hand stopped mid-air, and he looked in astonishment at Mark Watney, who was squatting cautiously in the open space behind the wooden house. He carefully observed for a moment, and finally looked up and said, "I'm not mistaken, these are indeed potato sprouts." David wanted to say impossible. He had lived here for 2 years. How could he not notice the wild potatoes under his nose? Just as he was about to speak, after locking eyes with Mark Watney for a second, he suddenly realized something and blurted out a retort. "What's that? A food that's easy to grow and high in yield?" Mark didn't dwell on it, simply assuming that people in this world didn't know the edible value of potatoes. That wasn't surprising, after all. On his world, humans hadn't known for a long time that they were edible, and quite delicious at that. The discovery of wild potatoes proves they can be grown here. Mark Watney had originally planned to cultivate potatoes within the base on Mars, but cultivating them on Mars presented numerous challenges and a low probability of success. By comparison, bringing those live potatoes here and cultivating a potato field in this world, continuously growing them in large quantities, would not only ensure their own food supply but also contribute to the village. It was simply perfect. Excited, Mark Watney didn't want to continue his tour. He couldn't wait to begin his own potato field plan, mentally calculating how much land he would need and where to plant it. Watching Mark Watney mutter to himself, David didn't interrupt his thoughts. Instead, he turned to look at the potato seedlings at his feet. Fresh, emerald green leaves sprouted from the black earth. After a moment's careful observation, David noticed a subtle difference between the ground beneath his feet and the ground beyond. An illusion. He looked again, unsure if he was mistaken, or if he had simply never noticed such a subtle difference before. But one thing was certain, there had never been any wild potatoes in this place before. He'd lived there for 2 years, and he'd harvested every edible and foraged vegetable and berry in the surrounding fields. There was no way he'd overlooked a crop right under his nose. Besides, it was not like he didn't recognize potatoes. If they hadn't existed before, there was no reason for them to suddenly appear out of nowhere. The most plausible explanation was Mark Watney, who was mumbling and calculating beside him. Could it be that the rewards aren't just for people like me, but also include tangible objects like potatoes? David pondered. This kind of physical reward must have a special connection to the person giving it, just like Mark Watney and potatoes. In the story, it was potatoes that helped Mark survive on Mars until rescue arrived and he successfully returned to Earth. But potatoes growing behind a house are easy to find. How do you find or claim something else? Chapter 11 Invincible Potato. David didn't dwell on it for long, for there was no point in dwelling on it. Until he faced a situation like this, everything was just speculation. Rather than wasting time dwelling on uncertainties, it was better to address the immediate issues at hand, for example, cultivating a field and planting potatoes. Mark Watney held a bag of live potatoes, the foundation for his successful potato field and mass production on Mars in the storyline. The bag of live potatoes lay before David and Fordring. "Isn't this a potato?" The knowledgeable Fordring recognized it, too. It was a common food in Azeroth. Fordring's words reminded David that Azeroth also had many familiar crops, a fact he had previously overlooked. "It's not a lot, but it's enough to eat for a few days, along with the venison and wolf meat." "No, these are for planting," David immediately explained to Fordring the purpose of the bag of potatoes. "Just now, when I was showing Mark around, I unexpectedly discovered wild potatoes growing next to the village. Mark thinks the land here should be suitable for growing potatoes." "Oh? If successful, won't that mean we have a stable food supply?" Fordring finally realized the significance of the bag of potatoes before him. He was well aware of the situation in David's winter village. The situation was clear and easy to explain. Problems like the low temperatures and the difficulty of surviving in winter could be overcome, but food was the most difficult issue. Without a stable food supply, it would be difficult to truly establish a village and attract more people to settle here. Once the food problem was solved, the rest would be a piece of cake. Winter was cold, so they could invest more effort in their homes. Even if every house had a fireplace, they could still burn firewood. After all, the forest was not far away, and there was plenty of firewood. At the same time, cultivating fields that could produce a stable harvest would attract farmers. With enough farmers, blacksmiths, stonemasons, tailors, and other professionals would settle here, and the village would gradually flourish. Fordring had anticipated these things, and David certainly had as well, so he was delighted. Mark Watney, on the other hand, marveled at his ability to travel between worlds at will. As a scientist, he was curious about the reason for this miraculous phenomenon. Even the potatoes before him couldn't attract him. For Mark Watney, the food problem had been largely solved since he discovered he could travel to this world. With the discovery of wild potatoes, that problem was gone. As an accomplished botanist, he was confident in his judgment and didn't believe it could be wrong. Therefore, a vast supply of potatoes awaited his enjoyment, though it would take time to obtain them. It's amazing. Not only am I the first human to survive alone on Mars, but I'm also the first to set foot on and confirm the existence of another world, well, maybe even another planet far, far away from our solar system. After mumbling for a long while, Mark Watney finally returned his attention to the question of how to cultivate the fields. Where are we going to plant the potatoes? Do you have any requirements? Mark, David, and Fording stood outside, gazing at the vast river in the distance. If possible, I'd like to plant them here. Mark chose a spot west of the village, a little way out, but not too far. This location was probably chosen to be as close to the Winter River as possible for easier access to water. After observing it carefully for a moment, David suggested that Mark plant the potato fields next to the cabin, closer to them. His reasoning was sound. Closer proximity would allow for better oversight, as this place wasn't as peaceful as it seemed, and the wild animals in the forest wouldn't stay out. Well, you do have a point, Mark agreed, unsure if David was making this arrangement out of safety. The wild potatoes had suddenly appeared, and the soil around the cabin seemed to be different from that further away. While David couldn't be sure if he was overthinking it, there were only so many live potatoes at the moment, and he didn't want to take any chances. Therefore, planting them next to the cabin was the safest option. Even if he wanted to conduct tests, he would have to wait until he had a sufficient supply of potatoes. Having chosen a location, the next step was the arduous physical labor. Fortunately, the three men present were strong enough. Even Mark Watney, with his rigorous training, couldn't be treated like an ordinary person. Becoming an astronaut required extremely high physical fitness and required various physical training. Combined with his extensive botanical knowledge, he was also a skilled farmer. The three men diligently turned the soil with their tools. Winter Village, once deserted and seemingly doomed, was bustling with activity in the spring of its third year. David's heart was ablaze with joy, so engrossed in his toil that he lost sight of fatigue. It wasn't until Mark reminded him, "This is more than enough." "What? Enough? I haven't even put in much effort." David glanced down. It seemed he hadn't reclaimed much land. Was this enough? He glanced at his neighbor and understood. Iron Man Fording was incredibly efficient. He worked harder than Mark and David combined. Fording had already done most of the work on the vast expanse of freshly reclaimed, soft earth beneath his feet. Fording, leaning on his shovel, barely broke a sweat. This workload barely even counted as a warm-up. Next up was planting the potatoes. Mark would only need occasional oversight from then on. David and Fording wouldn't need any help until the harvest. "Leave it to me. I promise there'll be more potatoes than you can eat soon." Even though he'd only just planted the potatoes, David could already see the vast pile of potatoes before him. He even considered waiting until the first batch was harvested before heading to Iron Tree Castle to recruit farmers. As she was enjoying the bright future, Laura's figure gradually emerged from the distance. She looked utterly miserable, covered in blood and looking utterly miserable. Seeing her condition, David immediately released a holy light, transforming Laura into a 3,000-watt light bulb. "Don't worry, David, I'm not seriously injured. None of this blood is mine." Hearing Laura's words, David sighed. "So, all this blood on you is the enemy's? How many bandits have you killed?" "I don't know. There are so many of them on the island." Laura looked a little tired, not physically, but more mentally. Since being stranded on that island, her experiences had completely shattered all the knowledge she had accumulated over the years. Many unreasonable things happened before her, and unreasonable enemies kept appearing. Laura had no choice but to forge ahead and face them all. After 2 or 3 days, she was completely exhausted. If she hadn't been able to rest and replenish food and water in David's absolutely safe place, she would have collapsed. Listening to Laura's story, David not only encouraged her with "you can do it," but also offered to help her analyze the next steps. According to Laura, she had successfully sent a distress signal, and a plane even arrived to rescue them. But something strange happened, as if some mysterious force was trying to stop them, and the rescue plane mysteriously crashed. Meanwhile, A group calling themselves the Brotherhood of the Sun seemed intent on sacrificing her friend, Samantha. She desperately needed to rescue her friend, fearing any delay could lead to something terrible. "So, I can't stay long. I need to rest for a bit before I go," David said, sympathizing with Laura's urgency. In this series, Laura hadn't had much time to breathe, and the few times she did rest were more like fainting from exhaustion. After taking a few bites of meat, Laura wiped the stains off her face and hands, then stood before David. "Thank goodness I met you. Don't be so polite. It's just a small favor." David released his holy light once more, offering Laura shelter. "If you really want to thank me, once you've rescued your friends and escaped the terrible place, just bring me some goodies often." It's settled. Laura watched the golden light fade. She knew this magical power was hidden within her, protecting her from harm. In countless battles, if it weren't for this magical power, she wouldn't know how many times she would have died. It wasn't just bullets and explosions, but countless falls from great heights. It was all thanks to this power that Laura remained unscathed, allowing her to fight the enemy at her best. If it hadn't been for David, she suspected she would have perished on the island. Deeply grateful, she vowed to do everything she could to help him. Once she left the island and returned home. With the Crawford family's wealth and connections, developing and building a remote village wouldn't be difficult. The only problem was how to quickly transport all the supplies to this world. "It would be convenient if we could drive here," David said, unaware that someone had already offered to build his village. He was about to grab his bow and arrow and head north to find more prey. Suddenly, Mark stopped David and ran back to Mars to bring him some food. "Come try some food from my world. This is called sweet and sour chicken." Chapter 12, A Village in its Initial Form. Mark Watney had brought a huge surprise. Not only had his presence brought potatoes, but he also had the potential to improve the quality of life in David's small village in every way. Not only were there all sorts of modern tools, but the exquisite tableware and more comfortable clothing alone delighted David. Furthermore, the food stored at the Mars base included a wide variety of meals for the astronauts to choose from. Most of this food had been left at the base, and Mark Watney was showing it off to David and Fording. Sweet and sour chicken, Hungarian goulash, pasta, toast, meatloaf, cheese and apples. He poured out the various items, all heated up at the base before him. "Looks good," Fording surveyed the dazzling array of food before him. While he had no idea how it would taste, the vibrant array looked quite appetizing. David swallowed hard. It had been so long since he'd tasted modern food. In this relatively backward world, cooking methods were crude, seasonings were scarce, and he couldn't use them freely. Only in the past 2 years at this camp had he been able to relax a bit. Even so, the food he made was just so-so, far from delicious, and the variety was limited. It was nothing compared to his past life, where he could eat whatever he wanted, however he wanted. Ever since arriving in this world, David had wanted to show these otherworldly bumpkins the majesty of the foodie nation, but circumstances had prevented him from studying such matters. After a hearty meal, Mark began to think about what he could bring back to David and Fording. Since those things were either useless or would be abandoned at the base, it would be better to bring them to Winter Village, where he could live more comfortably. Just leave enough supplies at the base. Even once he's figured out how to reunite with the next group of astronauts, he can bring everything he can to David before leaving the base. With this in mind, Mark Watney soon became the busiest person in Winter Village. Besides tending to the potato fields, he spent his days shuffling supplies back and forth, which led to numerous test cases. Currently, both David and Fording knew only that people from the other world, like Fording and Laura, could travel relatively freely between the two worlds, but they weren't sure what the restrictions were. Through various tests, Mark had confirmed that items carried or lifted could be carried to the other world without issue. However, anything he couldn't lift, even a fully controlled cart, couldn't travel between the two worlds. This was even more problematic with larger vehicles. Mark had actually tried to drive a rover over, but unfortunately, it failed. Furthermore, Mark and Fording discovered another limitation. To leave Winter Village, David's world, one had to be within a certain radius centered on the village. In other words, if Mark or Fording wanted to leave the village, they could do so if they were within a certain radius and moved towards the village, intending to return to their own worlds. However, if they left this area, such as by the Winter River or in the northern forest, and then attempted to leave and return to their own worlds, nothing would happen, they would remain there. This meant that if Mark Watney strayed too far from the village and was attacked by wild beasts, he couldn't escape danger by fleeing back to Mars. Therefore, for safety reasons, Mark tried to stay within the village, avoiding unaccompanied travel. Especially not near the forest. Fording didn't have to worry about this. With his abilities, he didn't need to worry about his safety. After figuring out these things, Laura came to David twice more. Once, she came to confide in David, heartbroken over the loss of Ross, her mentor. Another time, she came to share good news. She had finally solved the mystery, understood what had happened to her on the island, and successfully resolved it. Congratulations, I won't be here for a while. I'll finish what I'm doing and come back home to see you. Laura said goodbye to David, Fording, and Mark Watney, a person she didn't know yet, and left. This time, she left all her weapons behind, making David's stockpile even more abundant. In this generation's story, from the time Laura and her companions were shipwrecked on an island, the various troubles they encountered, to Laura's resolution and escape with her surviving companions, all took place in just 4 or 5 days. In that short period, Laura rapidly transformed from a freshly graduated college student embarking on her first adventure into a highly capable archaeologist. With David's divine protection, Laura's progress and combat effectiveness were greatly enhanced. It's a pity I didn't get to participate in it myself. This was David's biggest regret during this period, especially now that he possessed greater strength than Laura. He was particularly disappointed not to be able to join in the fun. In his spare time, he would ponder whether his cheat code would evolve and upgrade in the future. Would he be able to travel to the worlds he was familiar with? That would be fun, wouldn't it? Unfortunately, he couldn't go anywhere now. He could only wait for someone to find him. However, those few short days weren't just for Laura. David's life was profoundly transformed as well. From a hunter with little hope, he'd become a promising minor lord, pending official promotion. Furthermore, he'd developed a remarkable talent for archery and learned how to harness the holy light, becoming a qualified new priest. His physical fitness had also improved slightly, and he believed it would continue to improve with time. According to Fording, David, blessed with a holy light, didn't need to worry about overtraining and the resulting damage. He could train like crazy, and as long as he survived, the holy light would heal him, ensuring no hidden injuries. With Fording's blessing, David had plenty of motivation to improve his physical condition in the days ahead. Every day, he and Fording would go to the northern forest to cut down trees, carrying the simply treated wood back to the village for storage. The main reason for resuming the tree-cutting program was that Mark had determined it was impossible to carry large amounts of resources back and forth at once. Even if Laura offered to help, for convenience's sake, it would be best to use wood that was readily available. Otherwise, relying on Laura to carry bricks back and forth all by herself, that would be too beautiful a sight, and Laura might even want to bludgeon David to death with her pickaxe. So David only planned to ask Laura for some glass windows, cement, and a small amount of metal to make the cabin more airtight. Besides felling trees and stockpiling lumber, David would set aside some time each day to practice archery and shooting, and learn basic combat techniques from Fording. In his spare time, David would sometimes hunt for game at the edge of the forest to replenish his rapidly depleted meat supply. During this time, Fording would study English with Mark Watney, often fishing by the river. Fording had noticed that both Laura and Mark spoke the same language, and he felt the need to learn it. In the evenings, he would study the world's common language with David. Mark was happy to be Fording's teacher, and he also wanted to see if he could master the holy light. Fording saw no reason to object. Everyone in Winter Village had something to do, their schedules packed, yet no one saw anything wrong with this kind of life. This world lacked entertainment, so after dinner, they couldn't just lie down and bask in the sun all day, could they? Perhaps when the sun could even increase their holy light, David would do just that. Now, driven and dedicated to self-improvement, his progress was rapid, and in just 2 weeks, he had become what Fording called an outstanding young priest. Furthermore, the most important event for the winter villagers was the successful sprouting of the potato fields. Seeing the fresh green leaves peeking through the soil filled David with joy. Even Mark, who had long been certain that potatoes would grow, was delighted. Once they had enough potatoes, their lives would improve. Even if he could never leave Mars or return to Earth, he could still choose to live on in this world. Just as everyone was filled with hope for the future, Laura returned, bringing even more surprises. "Guys, I'm here to see you," Laura, dressed in a black jacket and jeans, greeted everyone cheerfully. "It's only been 2 weeks, but I missed you guys so much." David suppressed a complaint, hugging Laura before asking about her situation. "It looks like you've dealt with all your troubles." "Yes," Laura nodded, a hint of dejection in her expression. This adventure had taught her so much, not only growing her into a brilliant archaeologist and adventurer, but it also cost her several companions, including Ross, who had been like a mentor. But the past was over, and grief couldn't bring the dead back. Having adjusted her mindset, Laura was looking to the future. For example, David's world was worth exploring. Before that, "We should improve our living quarters." Laura noticed the large pile of lumber and guessed that David and the others had similar concerns. "I can help with that." Chapter 13 Winter Village is contracted by me, Laura. Laura's assistance was comprehensive. She wasn't just preparing to provide building materials so David and his family could build a better house, she'd also ordered a large quantity of daily necessities, clothing, shoes, and spices, and even some weapons and ammunition, not just guns, but also some modern cold weapons. The 3 men sat in a row on a log, each a bit bewildered as Laura, holding a small notebook, described the various supplies. "That's all I can think of for now," Laura finally finished, took a swig of water, and paused before asking, "Anything I missed?" "Well, I didn't expect you'd bought so much in such a short time." Then she thought, considering the Crawford's wealth and connections, while these things sounded like a lot, they weren't a big deal. Even the weapons weren't a big deal for the Crawfords. "I just placed an order, and the items will arrive over the next few days." Laura suddenly frowned. Thank goodness I didn't order too much building material. She had just learned about the restrictions on what could be brought in. If she had followed through and ordered a large quantity of building stone, would she have been constantly carrying bricks back and forth? Right now, it was just carrying cement powder, window glass, waterproofing, and the like, which wasn't too much of a hassle. The rest, like clothes and weapons, were easier to move. They could just make a few trips back and forth. "By the way, could you buy some extra books?" Fording waited until Laura finished speaking before offering his own idea. Books for learning English. He'd been studying English with Mark Watney for a while, but it was only the beginning. He felt that books would help him master the language faster, allowing him to communicate with Laura and Mark without David acting as a translator. "That's easy." Laura readily agreed to Fording's request. Unexpectedly, David, as if on a whim, also requested some books. "Oh? What kind of books do you need?" Fording wanted to learn English, so Laura would just need to buy a variety of English textbooks, from basic to advanced. She could even bring some instructional videos. After all, she was planning to set up a generator in Winter Village to facilitate the use of electronics. "I'm not sure exactly what kind I need. Please help me prepare them." David thought for a moment and realized he didn't know what kind of books he needed. "Books that record the various histories of your world should suit my needs." "Oh, there's quite a lot of content there." Laura understood David's meaning. It seemed the village chief wanted to learn from her world's advanced experience to better govern the village. "I'll pick a few for you first. If you have any questions after reading them, I'll help you find relevant books." "Okay." Laura's suggestion was reasonable, and David didn't think it was wrong, so he nodded in agreement. In fact, his fundamental purpose in asking Laura for books was to rationalize certain things, such as his knowledge of Chinese or the occasional Earth-like thoughts. These things became impossible to hide as they spent more time together. The best way was to have a reasonable explanation. Learning these things through Earth knowledge was logical. Of course, if their relationship was really good enough, telling the other person that he had traveled from Earth to this world seemed possible. David hadn't decided whether to tell the other person or not, so he had 2 options. After watching Laura write a few words in her notebook, she stood up and prepared to go back. "Leaving now, of course. I don't want to live with you until the houses are built." Although Laura was not a spoiled young lady, she would not deliberately put herself in trouble in her daily life when not on an adventure. "But I'll come here often. See you tomorrow." "See you tomorrow." Similar scenes became the norm for the next period of time. With the modern tools and materials Laura provided, the construction of the new residence was greatly accelerated. Soon, the few people dug the foundations for the 4 wooden houses and then built the basic frames. Because David and Fording had excellent strength and physical fitness, and Mark and Laura were good at manual labor, they completed the construction of the wooden houses just in time for the first batch of potatoes to be harvested. All 4 wooden houses were one-room designs, each with a fireplace for heating. Although the beds, tables, chairs, and cabinets were made by a few amateurs and looked a bit crude, it didn't matter if the things they made themselves looked a little less attractive. Gazing at the 4 brand new wooden houses around them, they ate freshly harvested potatoes. Enough had been set aside for replanting, accompanied by food and drinks specially brought by Laura, and began celebrating. Celebrating the birth of Winter Village. Previously, it was just a pioneering camp, but now with real shelter and cultivated farmland, it could be considered a true village. While building the houses, Mark and Laura also crafted some furniture, including a rectangular table for sharing meals. The 4 sat on either side of the table, enjoying the joy of their labor. With a bountiful harvest of potatoes and a sturdy, warm home, David was overjoyed to see Winter Village gradually getting back on track. The others were also happy. Fording now had a suitable retreat, even in this world, making it easier for him to visit his family more often. Mark Watney no longer had to worry about starving to death or perishing on the desolate Martian landscape due to a sudden breakdown of the base's facilities. He now spent more time in Winter Village, visiting the Mars base daily to check on the situation. Laura's thoughts were more complex. She had found a place where adventure was possible, and she felt the world held much to explore. She also felt Winter Village was a wonderful place, a perfect place to call home. David, taking a sip of the wine Laura had brought him, gazed at the 4 wooden houses on the east side of the village and began to ponder his next steps. His understanding of the light hadn't deepened recently, but the ample physical labor and practice of combat skills had steadily improved his physique. Combined with the various weapons Laura had brought him, his combat effectiveness was now far greater than before. Perhaps they could explore the forests to the north and, if possible, eliminate the wolf pack threat once and for all. The constant threat of this enemy threatening the village from afar made him uneasy. After he expressed his thoughts, Fording agreed. With housing and food issues largely resolved, the next step was to deal with the external enemies. What about Mark? What are you planning to do next? Thanks to his textbooks, Fording's English had improved rapidly, and he could now hold basic daily conversations with everyone. Tending to the potato fields and studying Holy Light lore every day, there really isn't much to do. Mark had been studying Holy Light lore. Even though Fording's English wasn't good enough for advanced explanations, asking David many basic questions was enough. However, no matter how hard he tried, the Holy Light showed no sign of responding. Compared to David's mastery of the Holy Light on his first try, Mark seemed completely outmatched. Even though Fording had explained that Mark's current situation was normal, while David's was a unique case and couldn't be used as a reference, he still felt a little frustrated. With no progress in the Holy Light and his food and shelter problems solved, Mark wondered what he would do next. Was he really just going to hang around here for a few years? Maybe I can revisit my previous plan and give it a try, Mark thought for a moment, offering his answer. What plan? David looked at Mark, remembering what he had done in the original storyline. Could Mark be planning to go to Mars and grow potatoes again? Growing potatoes on Mars. I'd love to see if my idea works. For a botanist, this was undoubtedly a tempting proposition. For Mark Watney now, growing potatoes on Mars wasn't just a matter of survival, it was simply a scientific project. He was also considering that if he could successfully contact NASA, growing potatoes would help explain how he'd managed to survive on Mars until rescue arrived. He hadn't planned to tell anyone about Winter Village. Sounds like an interesting plan. Over time, Laura and Mark became familiar with each other. Hearing about Mark's plans to grow potatoes on Mars, she found his idea quite promising, though it was a shame she couldn't witness it firsthand. Furthermore, after this time together, Laura understood Mark's reaction to her name. In his own world, Lara Croft was a world-renowned archaeologist. Surprised and delighted to have become a global celebrity on another Earth, Laura boasted to David and Fording the entire day. This left David, who knew the truth, speechless, and he had to hold back to avoid revealing the truth. Where's Laura? Are you going to the forest to eliminate those wolves? Laura took a bite of a potato. She didn't know if it was an illusion, but she felt that the potatoes tasted better than those in her own world. I'm going to go to the forest with you to take a look. It was not convenient to run too far for the time being, so it would be nice to explore the area around Winter Village and gain some experience in exploring the primeval forest. Oh, by the way, to celebrate the completion of your new home, I've prepared gifts for you. Before David could ask any more questions, Laura suddenly pointed to the box that had been placed on the table for a long time. One for each person. No need to fight over it. Chapter 14 Red Cloak. Laura handed a bag to David, who was sitting next to her. Her face was filled with anticipation. But David felt Laura's expression was a little off, as if she was waiting to see something fun. He didn't think too much of it. After all, Laura wouldn't give him a bomb or anything like that, it was probably just a prank. He took the bag in his hand and saw a ball of red as soon as he opened the bag. What is this? He reached out and pulled the contents of the bag. David stood up and shook it slightly to see clearly what he was holding, a cloak with a hood. This was not a strange thing. It could even be said to be a very practical thing. It's just that the color. Yes, a cloak. Try it on. For fear that David would refuse, Laura stood up and helped David put the cloak on. She even put the hood on David's head. Isn't it nice? David looked at the red cloak with white fur edges, and wanted to complain 1,000 times in his heart. It feels good, but the color. Oh, in my world, only the best hunters can wear red cloaks, Laura explained seriously, without a smile on her face. This is an honor, is that so? David looked at Laura, then at Mark. Mark, who was covering his mouth, nodded seriously. Now David and Fording both knew that Laura and Mark were from a place called Earth and lived in a similar era, but there was no Mars exploration program in Laura's world, which confirmed that the two were not from the same Earth. Well, thank you so much for the gift, he silently said to himself. I'll make a note of this. David took off his cloak and carefully put it back in his bag. Such an important gift, I'll keep it safe. Well, it's getting warmer now, so I won't need it. I can wait until it gets colder. As time passed, the temperature gradually warmed up, and there was no need to build a fire to keep warm at night. Laura's true meaning wasn't that the cloak wasn't needed for the time being, but that David should wear it when it got colder. What a shame. In my world, the legendary hunter slew the evil grey wolf wearing a red cloak. Considering what you're about to do, this is a good metaphor. David could only express his gratitude again. Thank you for your trouble. Laura nodded in satisfaction, then gave Mark a portable hard drive filled with songs. He could finally get rid of the pile of disco music Captain Lewis had left behind. That's great. Until recently, Mark had only complained to Laura about his captain's poor taste, because he felt that neither Fording nor David could understand his pain. Unexpectedly, Laura had actually saved him. Finally, Laura gifted Fording a finely crafted two-handed bastard. Although she had previously sent him some modern cold weapons, they were mostly one-handed swords, short swords, and daggers. Fording found them to be of excellent quality, though a bit too light to handle. Delighted at receiving such a useful weapon, he expressed his gratitude to Laura and began to ponder a return gift. He reflected that he had little to offer except light-related knowledge. Perhaps he could consider returning to Azeroth and acquiring some other knowledge? He wondered what Laura might be interested in. The meal lasted until the moon rose high in the sky. For the group, accustomed to early bedtimes and early rises, this was already a late night. After quickly clearing the table and carefully storing the remaining food, they each returned to their cabins to rest. Perhaps it was the new bed, which was infinitely more comfortable than in years, or perhaps it was the wine he'd drunk, but David fell asleep quickly after lying down. He even had all sorts of sweet dreams, including one of Laura in a red cloak. He opened his eyes, lying in his comfortable new bed, and David had no desire to get up. Since arriving in this backward world, this was the first time he'd considered staying in bed. The new bed was so comfortable, the ceiling effect of the quilt had intensified exponentially, and he almost couldn't break free. Thank goodness my mental strength is strong enough. Get up, wash up. When David left his cabin, he found everyone else already up, and Mark had already prepared breakfast. Hey, David. It's rare to be up so late today. Yeah, the new bed is so comfortable that I almost didn't want to get up. Ha ha ha. I thought it was because you drank too much last night. In Mark's eyes, David was a young man living in a backward world, living in difficult conditions and without access to modern alcoholic beverages. It was normal for his body to be uncomfortable. How could a little wine like that possibly defeat me? Sitting around the square table, everyone settled on their responsibilities while enjoying breakfast. Fording would remain in the village, responsible for dismantling 2 of the 4 temporary wooden houses, with the remaining 2 to be used as warehouses. According to the plan David had shared with the others, after the accommodations were completed, the temporary wooden houses would be dismantled one by one, and more durable structures like the kitchen and warehouse would be rebuilt. These tasks weren't urgent and would be completed gradually in the coming days. After inspecting the potato fields, Mark would return to the Mars base to begin his own Martian potato project. This project would rely entirely on the resources of the Mars base, without any support from Winter Village. It was a self-imposed research project for Mark, a botanist. The project was initially challenging, so Mark would spend most of his time on Mars for the next few days, returning only to eat and sleep. Let's go to the forest to the north and, if possible, eliminate the wolves, David, taking the last bite of potatoes and homemade bacon, reminded Laura. Bring plenty of weapons, because I don't know what else might be in the forest besides wolves. Got it? If you run into trouble, send out a signal flare. Fording gave David and Laura a final warning, telling them to notify him if they encountered any danger they couldn't resolve, and he would rush to support them as quickly as possible. David nodded. With Fording's skills, he felt there wasn't an enemy near Winter Village he couldn't handle. After changing into new, easy-to-move clothes, the training uniform Laura had bought him, and ensuring they had all the necessary supplies, ropes, water, and ammunition, David slung his backpack. He also tucked a Wild Hunter revolver and a hatchet on either side of his waist, picked up his brand new hunting bow, and slung the quiver at his waist. Once he was sure he could draw an arrow with a simple reach, David turned and looked at Laura. Laura was similarly armed, carrying a shotgun in addition to a bow and pistol. She also had a pair of mountaineering picks on her hip, but less of a hand axe. Judging by their attire, it was impossible to tell whether they were going on an adventure, hunting, or even a war. Mark Watney's words. Waving to Mark, David and Laura headed north toward the forest. After a stretch of open plains and a gentle slope, they officially entered the forest. The once comfortable temperature suddenly seemed to drop several degrees. A chill invaded their bodies from all sides, as if the entire forest were greeting the two outsiders. It's quite cool here. They advanced in silence for a while, and when they looked back, they could no longer see Winter Village in the distance. All they could see was the massive trees, now lush green. Have you been here before? No, David answered Laura's question quickly. I used to stay on the edge of the forest, even circumventing it in search of prey. I never ventured deep into the woods. The last time he was attacked by wolves was the deepest he'd ever been in the woods, and that experience proved David's previous caution was correct. I didn't expect you to be such a cautious person. Even though they'd known each other for a while, Laura felt her understanding of David wasn't comprehensive enough, even less than her understanding of forging. True, Laura had searched for Tiran forging after returning, and had yielded much. But searching for David yielded no useful information. David's name was so common that she couldn't determine which of the results matched the young man beside her. Of course, she didn't rule out the possibility that David didn't exist in any records of her world, and this complete unknown only intensified Laura's curiosity. A hunter who isn't cautious would have perished long ago at the hands of a wild beast. This wasn't David's own observation, but a phrase constantly repeated by the old hunter who had raised and taught him, a phrase he acknowledged. So, you're now the mayor of Winter Village, a hunter, and a priest of the Holy Light. Laura found this combination of professions quite novel. You spend every day learning combat techniques from Tiran, and you're also thinking of becoming a warrior. There aren't any restrictions anyway. It's always good to have more resources. It allows me to deal with various situations with ease. David carefully observed his surroundings, but saw no signs of wild animals, let alone wolves. However, he had an unexpected discovery. These should be ore. Looking ahead at the hill, which was not even as tall as the surrounding trees, David carefully examined the stones on the ground, which shone with various metallic lusters. Laura squatted down and examined it for a moment before answering. It's copper ore and iron ore. That should be good news for you, of course. The discovery of easily accessible metal ore near the village was certainly a boon for its development. Just based on these ores, today's trip wasn't in vain. After walking around the hillside for a while, David and Laura discovered a naturally formed cave. Just as David was about to light a torch and go in, he glanced at Laura beside him with a troubled look. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 15 Ancient Altar. Laura was puzzled by David's expression. You want me to stay outside, if possible? Don't worry, I have more experience with this kind of situation than you do. Laura thought David was worried about her safety, but having been on one adventure before, She didn't think such an ordinary cave could threaten her. She had no idea that David's concern wasn't for Laura's safety, but for the safety of the cave itself. After all, the man known as the Tomb Destroyer, known for his ability to collapse wherever he walked, was worried that the cave would collapse the next second he and Laura entered. It was impossible to explain such an outrageous reason to Laura, so she lit a torch and entered the cave. Laura also pulled out a flashlight hanging from her belt and followed David into the cave. The temperature inside the cave was slightly lower than outside, making David feel a little chilly, but otherwise, after walking for a while, they didn't notice anything unusual. Although the cave had a clear downward and spiral path, it didn't take long for them to reach the end. That's it. Looking at the cavern, which had reached its end, Laura, glancing at the various ores adorning the surrounding walls, could only helplessly remark, "It looks like this is just an ordinary natural mine." Yeah, and it's not difficult to mine. This type of open pit mine is the easiest to mine. He couldn't determine the reserves at the moment, but even if they weren't high, it would be enough for Winter Village's current needs. Looks like we'll need to hire a blacksmith and a few miners. Running his hand over the metallic ore on the wall, David thought to himself that if this were a farming and development game, his birthplace would be quite good. While a bit remote, its location had its advantages. It wouldn't be targeted by various forces. Looks like this is just an ordinary natural mine. Let's go. Wait, David was about to turn and leave when Laura, crouched in a corner, seemingly researching something, called out, "There seems to be wind here." Huh? David watched Laura squat with her hands spread out, feeling for something. Then, she fumbled along the wall for a while, finally stopping and tapping lightly with her mountaineering pick. "There's a cave here, so it's normal for caves like this to have smaller caverns and crevices, right? Just wanted to see if I could go deeper." Standing up, he swung his mountaineering pick and struck the spot he'd identified with a few powerful blows. Expecting it would take considerable effort to crack the rock, Laura was surprised to find that with just 2 hits, the entire wall was shattered. But that wasn't the most crucial thing. The key was the chain reaction that shattered the rock, crumbling even the area Laura was standing on. Laura felt a sudden drop, and she plummeted downward. David reacted quickly. As Laura gasped and the area beneath her feet began to crumble, he lunged to catch her, but he was a beat too slow, watching her plummet before his eyes. Then, mid-air, he effortlessly stabbed the pick into the rock wall in front of him, clinging securely to David's position less than a meter away. Phew, luckily I reacted quickly. He glanced up at David, who was half leaning out and performing the purple myrtle hand gesture a meter above him. "What's up? Were you startled?" After the Himiko incident, Laura was no longer the ordinary girl they'd first met. Now she was a top-tier adventurer. Experienced in emergencies and always able to make the most accurate decisions in the shortest possible time. She'd been through similar situations countless times and knew exactly how to handle them, so her movements this time were considered slow. "Should I pull you up?" David had already withdrawn his hand. He'd already seen that Laura could use her climbing pick to climb up even without his help. She hung on, unmoved, unwilling to come up. "Wait, there seems to be something down there." Laura grabbed a few more flashlights, lit them, and tossed them down. The flashlight fell to the ground the instant it was dropped. Laura wasn't far below, quite close, in fact. Even if she hadn't been able to hook herself to the wall with her climbing pick, a fall wouldn't have killed her if she'd done it right. "I'll go down and take a look." Using 2 climbing picks, she slid down a bit before finally leaping down, reaching the bottom with deft movements. She found the space wasn't large, only about 100 square meters. Standing there, she could clearly see the entire area with a flashlight. So, she quickly noticed something special. At the center of the cavern was a stone tablet, clearly man-made. Inscribed on it were the words, "It's the common language." These days, besides Fording diligently studying English, Laura and Mark had also been learning the common language of this world. In fact, Fording was also learning it. "Thanks for your protection, and hereby present the fruits of my hard work. Hope." The writing was fragmented, most of it illegible, with only a few fragments still readable. As Laura moved, she quickly located the tablet's base and more traces of human construction hidden beneath the dust. There's a finely crafted stone slab underneath. The sound of footsteps behind her informed her that David had reached her. David, too, crouched down and gently prodded at it, revealing a stone slab with various patterns carved into it. "It seems this area is paved with stone slabs," As for the stone tablet before him, he had already examined it, and the few details he could discern had already been read out by Laura. This is an altar. Turning it back and forth a few times, Laura quickly grasped its purpose. It's used to thank the gods for their blessings and bountiful harvests. Laura suddenly remembered that when David had introduced this world to her, he had mentioned that common tongue was the language spoken by humans, meaning this altar must have been built by humans. Was this place once the territory of a human kingdom? From what I know of history, no human kingdom has ever ruled this far north. The Kingdom of Tiran is the northernmost kingdom in human history. The history and glories of the Kingdom of Tiran were often recounted throughout the kingdom, which was why David spoke so confidently. But now he wondered, could this be an elven altar? But the elves didn't seem willing to live in such a cold place. Perhaps a small number of humans once lived here. It's not uncommon for people to live in isolation. Just because a human kingdom hasn't ruled this area doesn't mean no one has ever been here. Perhaps those who once lived here didn't survive due to environmental factors or other factors. Of course, there's another possibility. The altar didn't actually exist, but it appeared when Laura appeared. David couldn't help but think this way. After all, there was the example of Mark Watney and the potatoes, and Laura on the ancient altar made perfect sense. If that's the case, what's the purpose of this thing? Looking at the only readable words on the stone tablet, David speculated that it was hoping for an offering of harvested grain, and then to protect it from continued harvests? Perhaps we can try. David stood there, pondering various possibilities. Laura had already roughly explored the entire altar area. After confirming that the patterns on the stone slabs on the ground held no special meaning, she lost interest in the place. The only thing worth studying was the stone tablet, and its content was pitifully scant. It seems there's nothing else. Laura searched the surrounding rock walls for cracks, but found nothing. I don't know why, but this ancient altar and the mineral vein are intertwined. Perhaps it's caused by tectonic shifts. With nothing left to explore, Laura lost interest in the area and prepared to return to the surface via the rope David had used to descend, secured at the top with a nail. David didn't waste any more time. After Laura climbed back up, he too left the area, retrieving the rope and exiting the cave together. Continue searching for the wolves. What is that? Laura, emerging into the sunlight, was startled by the sight of a massive creature. It was nearly 3 meters tall, with incredibly thick arms, a body covered in dirty white fur, and a massive wooden club in its hand. While Laura was startled by it, the giant monster also spotted Laura and David. Without a second's exchange of words, their eyes met before the monster roared and charged at them, club in hand. Without a single call to caution, Laura and David launched their attacks the instant the monster launched its attack. In the blink of an eye, 2 arrows were lodged, one aimed at the eye and the other at the throat. The monster reacted quickly, halting and dodging the arrows. While they couldn't immediately eliminate the monster, the 2 arrows bought David and Laura some time. Raising his hand, he unleashed a golden holy light, enveloping Laura and David in golden shields. David then extended his left hand and aimed at the massive monster. Before the monster could react, a holy light appeared and exploded before its eyes. While the holy light didn't cause much damage, it did successfully disrupt its vision and slow its movements once more. Seeing that Laura's arrows, shot through the gaping hole, had little impact on the monster, David dropped his bow and strode forward. At the same time, a golden flame blazed in David's right hand. As David rushed in front of the monster, the suddenly expanding holy light shield blocked the giant monster's wooden stick in midair. The golden flame in David's hand became even more blazing and fierce. With a flash of strong light, the holy fire that David threw out instantly transformed the monster into a giant bonfire. Chapter 16 Archaeologist. David stood silently before the massive flames. With a golden glow still lingering around him, Laura must have looked tall and handsome. Just as he was contemplating whether to use the holy light to form a word or pattern behind him, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Okay, stop posing. You're already looking great. He glanced helplessly at Laura. She acted as if she hadn't noticed anything, recovering the intact arrows. As for the ones stuck in the monsters, they would likely be reduced to charcoal along with them, impossible to recover. Didn't you learn the holy light from Tiran? How can you unleash flames? Laura knew David had learned the way of the holy light from Tiran Fordring, but holy light seemed like a light-like power. Could David have mastered some other power? This is holy fire, so, holy fire is a skill that priests can master after cultivating the holy light to a certain level. David explained briefly that this holy fire was still a holy light skill, not some new ability he had mastered. Although he hadn't yet figured out whether the so-called sacred fire was a flame imbued with the properties of holy light, or holy light that looked like fire, it was also possible that, in some ways, the two were essentially the same. Oh, Laura suddenly realized that, despite having searched for some information, she still hadn't paid enough attention to the details. It seemed she'd need to catch up on that. This move requires close proximity to work. David was silent for a moment. Instead of answering Laura, he asked another question. Don't you think this move is cool? Laura didn't answer, and David froze, unable to wait for an answer. Finally, the two of them tacitly passed on the topic. After a moment's silence, they both glanced at the corpse, which had become unrecognizable. Have you seen a creature like this before? Although it was only a brief encounter, the monster's size, its ferocious attack without any communication, and its defense, seemingly unaffected by multiple arrows, made Lord realize the danger it posed. No, David shook his head. He knew what Laura was asking. This is the first time I've seen a monster like this since I came here. I'm so thankful it hasn't burst out of the forest and attacked the village in the past 2 years. If that had happened, he wouldn't have stayed until now. Even if he hadn't died or been injured in the monster's attack, he would have simply left and fled back to Iron Tree Keep as fast as he could. After all, at that time, he was just a qualified, novice hunter, and there was no way he could have fought against such a monster. He felt incredibly fortunate at the thought, feeling incredibly lucky. If he had actually fled back to Iron Tree Keep, he might not have unlocked his cheat code. After all, after witnessing the dangers of pioneering, he would most likely have honestly explored other avenues, perhaps tinkering with unusual gadgets to earn more money and become a wealthy man in a bustling city. In that case, he would have missed out on everything he was experiencing now. That was dangerous? Laura thought David was referring to how she'd been living next door to a monster like this for over 2 years without realizing it, so she chimed in. Yet, I just wonder if there are more of them in the forest. Keep looking around. David shared his concerns. If it were just one, it would be fine, but if there were a whole group, the danger would be even greater. Of course, Laura was no timid person. Since she'd come to the forest to explore the situation, why would she just run away when she encountered danger? If she did, she should return to her own world. After all, the Crawford estate wouldn't be attacked by such monsters. But next, let's use some more powerful weapons. Laura had already slung her bow and arrows behind her back, replacing them with a shotgun. David, on the other hand, grabbed the Wild Hunter pistol that had been tucked into his waistband. This hunting pistol was best suited for dealing with larger creatures. Seeing David only had a pistol, Laura carefully observed the surroundings while offering her advice. If your world is full of giant monsters like these, I think we should prepare more powerful weapons. If I could, I'd love to carry a heavy artillery with me. Of course, the more heavy firepower the better. If he could, he'd open several arsenals in Winter Village, each with a banner on its gate reading, the more, the better. Haha, it looks like you're almost done with the books I brought you. Of course, I'm a diligent reader. David wasn't kidding. He read the books Laura brought him every night. Not only did he improve his character, but he also had a limited schedule and it helped him fall asleep better. What do you want to read next? Laura initially selected some history books, but later, David expressed interest in topics like the evolution of weapons or the details of a particular war. Laura would then go back and find the relevant reference books and bring them to David. Next time you come, bring me some history books from Eastern countries. Eastern? I've got that. If possible, bring some introductory textbooks in their languages. Are you planning on reading the original texts? Laura quickly understood David's intention. Yes, that way I can understand the content more accurately. That's true. Laura, herself fluent in multiple languages in her research on various ruins and ancient civilizations, agreed with David. It might take me some time. No, I'm not in a hurry. The two chatted as they journeyed through the forest. Cautiously leaving trails to avoid getting lost, they moved slowly. As darkness gradually darkened, they finally stopped. It wasn't to return, but rather because they had discovered a simple village. Monsters similar to the ones they had seen before, and even larger ones, lived here. Looking at the crude houses or huts built of wood and stone, David and Lord realized that these monsters possessed a certain level of intelligence, but their lifestyle was relatively primitive, and their intelligence seemed low. Look over there. David was still counting the monsters here. When he reached 11, Laura gently nudged him a few times, reminding him to look. Following Laura's finger, David realized why she had pointed his attention there. It's the altar. Compared to the previous altar, this one was significantly damaged. Only a small fragment of the stone platform remained. If it weren't for the prominent stone tablet, it wouldn't have been a different altar. There's even an offering on it. David didn't overlook the massive corpse in front of the stone tablet, a massive wolf with a sturdy build and snow white fur. Besides this enormous wolf, he saw several more carcasses in the middle of the village. It seemed these monsters had wiped out a pack. And that one was most likely the leader. Looks like these monsters have helped you get rid of a problem. Laura and David had come here to find and eliminate the wolf pack, only to discover their work had been done for them. I'd rather handle this wolf pack myself, David grinned. Though the wolves were gone, he now had a far greater problem. These giant monsters are far more troublesome than wolves. David also had a negative impression of these monsters. After all, the other side wanted to attack him and Laura the moment they met. Even after realizing they were intelligent beings, he was somewhat reluctant to communicate. What should we do next? Leave here first. David didn't consider his next move. He and Laura were right on the edge of the enemy village. If they discovered them, these monsters would swarm and attack, and even with the protection of holy light, it would be a huge problem. Of course, he could send a flare to call for Fording's help, but even Fording's speed would take time to arrive. After all, Fording was only a paladin, not a mage who could teleport. Anything could happen while he was traveling. To be on the safe side, it was best to leave. Whether he wanted to try to communicate with these neighbors and coexist peacefully, or to use force to eliminate them, he had to ensure absolute safety. In other words, if he wanted to take action, he had to go back and summon Fording, fully armed and equipped with sufficient firepower. Laura guessed David's intention and nodded in agreement. They retreated cautiously with David, ensuring they were out of sight of the monsters before retracing their original route. Having successfully returned to the mine, the two breathed a sigh of relief. Having encountered no danger beforehand, they figured the journey ahead would be equally safe. However, unsurprisingly, something unexpected happened. With a deafening roar, a monster, even more massive than the one David had previously slain, appeared before the two and charged straight at them. With a deafening roar, a strange red light shone from the giant monster's body. Glowing with a crimson glow, the giant completely ignored the blood that continuously bloomed from its body and charged resolutely towards Laura. After casting his holy light shield, David spotted the giant charging towards Laura and fired at its face, slowing it down as he moved. By the time his berserker had fired 6 rounds, he was just in front of Laura. Sheathing the berserker, David's hand once again clung to a surge of holy fire, and his newly developed ultimate move against giants made its second appearance. Watch out, Rihochi style, Great Snake Nagami, Laura, Cyrillic letter dare. Chapter 17. Beside the couch. With a wave of his arm, golden sacred fire erupted, and a massive bonfire appeared in front of the mine, illuminating the already dim forest depths like daylight. David's power did not disappoint, worthy of the dazzling sound and light effects. With a single blow, the enormous monster collapsed to the ground, and the eerie crimson glow dissipated beneath the scorching heat of the sacred fire. After a cautious wait, ensuring the monster was completely dead, David dispersed the sacred fire wrapped around his hand and turned to Laura, who looked speechless. Isn't that impressive? Incredible, Laura nodded, though a little speechless at David's childish behavior. After all, a single move instantly killed a giant monster that could withstand multiple shotgun blasts. David's move was truly powerful. But, isn't this spell called Holy Fire? Why does it call out the Rihochi style, Orichinagi? Orichinagi is a very powerful move that allows for better release of sacred fire. There's no conflict between them, David said casually, not wanting to elaborate further. To him, there was no fundamental difference between directly releasing sacred fire and using Orichinagi. Both unleashed a massive amount of sacred fire upon the target. After all, he knew nothing about Orichinagi and didn't know the details of how to use it properly, unless Kyokyu Sanagi or Shobifuku Sanagi ever arrived in Winter Village. Let's get out of here before we attract more trolls. Glancing at the now extinguished flames, 2 charred trolls lay on the ground. He wondered if this mine was a troll spawning point. Why did he always encounter such monsters? You're right, this place is too unsafe, Laura thought, and she and David quickly headed southward toward the forest. If they had any questions, they could ask them once they returned to Winter Village. This time, The journey passed without incident, and they made it out of the forest and back to Winter Village. David and Laura breathed a sigh of relief as they watched Mark and Fording chatting at the long table. Noticing their condition, the experienced Fording immediately guessed that their journey hadn't been smooth sailing, that they had likely encountered some enemy. After a closer look, Fording determined from their complexion and movements that they were unharmed. He felt relieved, knowing that the trip had been anything but a close call. "Sit down and rest for a while. I'll heat up dinner for you and we'll talk while you eat." "Thank you, Tiran." David and Laura unloaded their belongings and placed them aside, then sat at the wooden table to await dinner. Mark poured them 2 large glasses of water and curiously asked, "Is it good news or bad news?" "Both." He downed the water in one gulp, feeling that this exploration deep into the forest had yielded a lot. "The good news is, we don't have to worry about wolves' retaliation anymore." Oh, Mark didn't need to hunt far from the village, but even staying in the village still carried the risk of wild beasts. Not having to worry about the threat of wolves was certainly a good thing. But David had just said there was good news and bad news, and judging by the expressions of the 2 men just now, it seemed that things were more complicated than that. "We'll tell you the bad news when Fordring returns, then you 2 rest for a while. I'll go help Tiran." Mark didn't rush for a moment and got up to help Fordring. Although Winter Village had become more well-stocked with supplies following Mark's arrival and Laura's return to her home in England, they kept their dinners simple, focusing on stews and grills. Soon, a steaming pot of meat and potatoes was served, accompanied by French munitions provided by Laura and some packaged food provided by Mark. A simple dinner was laid out on the table. As they ate the stew, David recounted his and Laura's encounters in detail, and Fording and Mark, sitting across the table, were briefed on the details. "Troll." Fording listened to David and Laura's descriptions, recalling a creature from Azeroth. "Sounds like a Yeti." Hearing David's quick and easy use of the holy fire to kill such a creature, he concluded that the threat posed by it wasn't too great, at least not to him. "Can communicate." Mark Watney's focus differed from Fording's. He wondered if the creature was intelligent, perhaps they could attempt to communicate. However, from Laura and David's descriptions, it seemed the troll had attacked them upon sight, seemingly showing no interest in communication. Perhaps, David dipped his bread into the broth. "But it doesn't look like they were trying to communicate with us." Deep down, he preferred to eliminate the trolls. After all, their village was too close to Winter Village. If the trolls suddenly attacked, they wouldn't have any advance warning and would have to passively face the enemy once they were within reach. After chewing his juicy bread for a few seconds, David gave up his initial hesitation. He wasn't worried about being criticized for being too cruel. The trolls attacked him and Laura upon seeing them, and from that moment on, they were classified as hostile creatures. In short, we now have a group of ferocious neighbors, far more dangerous than wolves, David concluded briefly. "It seems that developing a life here will be more troublesome than we initially anticipated. If you truly want to make Winter Village a great place, these are things you must go through." Fording looked at David, suddenly curious about the extent of this young man's potential. Initially, Fording simply sought seclusion, a place unknown to everyone. Though he'd inexplicably arrived in another world, the conditions there perfectly suited his needs, so he settled there. Furthermore, David displayed remarkable talent for the holy light, and Fording saw it as a valuable opportunity to spread the light's teachings in another world, so he took the opportunity to teach David about it. Even when David expressed his desire to develop Winter Village, Fording didn't take it too seriously. He simply listened to David's description and realized that developing the village wouldn't be easy. Fording believed that perhaps, with the help of people from other worlds, David could establish Winter Village, becoming an officially recognized village within the Kingdom of Tiran, with David officially serving as village chief. However, taking further steps was extremely difficult, perhaps even impossible. This was due not only to the various challenges presented by the environment, but also to David's own personal struggles. Currently, David was just a young hunter of humble origins, and Fording didn't believe he had the ability to develop a village into a larger town. Fording had originally considered David's ability to successfully manage a small village a sign of exceptional talent. However, David's decisiveness upon discovering the troll village today had slightly changed Fording's mind. Not everyone, faced with such a situation, could decisively and decisively eliminate the hostile forces. Even a young man of humble origins, with no experience in governance, would hesitate when faced with a similar situation. Perhaps this young man can truly develop this village. David, unaware of Fording's thoughts, mentally formed his thoughts, attempting to ask Fording for help. Before he could even open his mouth, Fording offered his assistance. I'm living comfortably in Winter Village, and I don't want to be disturbed by a horde of trolls. Tomorrow I'll go to the forest and eliminate them. Fording, in his words, intended to single-handedly resolve the troll issue. David didn't actually let Fording go alone. He was the mayor of Winterfell, after all. How could he stand aside from such a major undertaking as eliminating a threat near the village? As for Laura and Mark Watney, one was a tourist and adventurer, the other a mere botanist. Such bloody work wasn't for them. Both were intelligent, understanding that Fording and David hadn't asked them to do so in order to protect them. Given their own circumstances, they remained silent. Rest well tonight, and tomorrow we'll go to the forest together. With Fording's words, the trolls were no longer a topic of discussion. Their fate was certain, destruction by Tiran Fording. Indeed, the next day, as David and Fording arrived at the troll settlement, they discovered that the trolls had shown no willingness to communicate. They charged directly at their attackers, and Tiran Fording demonstrated his incredible fighting prowess. Throughout, Fording slew the trolls without using the holy light, relying solely on the two-handed greatsword Laura had given him. Besides admiring the old man's heroic presence up close and gaining some experience in cold weapon combat, David barely had a chance to cast supporting holy light spells. He was practically shouting 6, 6, 6 from the side. Even the last troll, a size larger than the others and clearly the leader, roared and shone with an even more dazzling blood-red light, but it couldn't hold out for long under Fording's grasp and quickly fell to the ground. From the time they arrived at the troll village to the end of the battle, only a short time had passed. Anyone who had witnessed the encounter might have silently prayed, "Go for it, you white-haired trolls." Having completely eliminated the trolls, Fording stood with David before the stone tablet, frowning at the faint blood-red light emanating from it. This altar doesn't look like a good thing. Chapter 18, Freedom to Eat. David agreed with Fording's assessment. Compared to the altar he and Laura had discovered in the mines, this one was even more severely damaged. Only faint patterns could be discerned, and the contents of the writing were completely unrecognizable. Furthermore, the bloodstains surrounding the stone tablet, caused by the recent slaughter, made the tablet and the shattered stone platform glow a constant crimson glow, creating a deeply eerie atmosphere. The spells these trolls used earlier must have been derived from this altar. Fording was far more familiar with mystical powers than David, and given his recent battle with the trolls, he roughly deduced the altar's function, offering sacrifices to gain power. These trolls attack immediately upon seeing other creatures. Perhaps it's because of this altar. Fording speculated that the trolls' habit of attacking at the slightest disagreement stemmed from this. Anything not of their own kind was prey, and they killed it as a sacrifice to the altar, gaining that power. That's right, Fording raised his weapon, but looking at the two-handed heavy sword in his hand, he hesitated for a moment whether to strike. I should have brought a heavy hammer. These paladins and warriors from Azeroth had honed their bodies to such a high level that ordinary weapons were simply unsuitable for them. Instead, these men with bodies of steel, a weakened version, were particularly favored by those who looked outrageous. If Fording had been wielding a two-handed heavy hammer, he would have undoubtedly smashed it into the stone tablet without hesitation, completely destroying it. But now, he felt a little reluctant to use such a fine two-handed sword to chop stone. Leave it to me. Do you have a solution? Yes, David rummaged through his backpack and found what he needed. Lara brought some explosives earlier, so I put some in my backpack just in case. The idea was that if you were blocked by something or trapped in a cave, he could use this to blast his way out. Blowing up a stone tablet shouldn't be a problem. As for the mysterious power within this altar, it likely wouldn't be protecting the stone tablet, otherwise it wouldn't be in its current state. Boom. After setting the scene and igniting it, they fled to a safe distance. David and Fording watched the stone tablet explode into countless rubble. After standing quietly and observing for a moment, confirming that nothing strange had occurred and that the stone tablet was completely destroyed, David and Fording cleaned up the battlefield, burying the troll's body and searching for any suitable trophies. After their inspection, they were completely certain that these trolls lived a primitive lifestyle. Even if they possessed intelligence, they were not very different from other beasts. What a pity. If the giant wolf's body had been preserved intact, its fur would have been quite valuable. Fording looked at the massive wolf head discarded in the corner, likely left there after a meal, surrounded by other odds and ends. David glanced and recognized it as the head of the giant wolf that had been placed on the altar. The wolf had beautiful snow-white fur, and it was a pity that it hadn't been preserved. "We don't need any furs right now." After checking, the two men set out on their return journey. Having completely eliminated the threat near the village, they were in high spirits, chatting and laughing all the way back. Now that the food problem has been solved, and we've cultivated farmland capable of sustainably growing food, what are your plans? On the way back to the village, Fording was curious about David's next plans. Ever since becoming curious about David's capabilities, Fording had begun to follow his every move. This was a stark contrast to his initial attitude of whatever, as long as I have a place to stay, and in a sense, Fording had only just begun to integrate into Winter Village. David was delighted by this development. He knew that people like Mark and Fording, who were deeply involved in their own worlds, would find it difficult to truly become Winter Village residents. Initially, David hadn't truly intended to make them his own villagers. He simply hoped to leverage these people and the power behind them to develop the village. Once the village had farmland and comfortable housing, improving these hardware attributes, he would leverage these to attract more locals to join. This was his original plan. It now seemed possible to get them to truly stay in Winter Village and become residents. Take the pioneering order and head to Iron Tree Keep. Now that everything was in place, it was time for him to go to Iron Tree Keep and establish his position as village chief. Besides gaining Winter Village's recognition from the kingdom, I plan to recruit some villagers to Winter Village. A sufficient population is essential for the village's growth. Fording agreed with David's plan. He couldn't offer any better suggestions at the moment. Whether it was reclaiming more land or expanding the farmland, a sufficient population was essential. If possible, find more craftsmen. Winter Village lacked blacksmiths, stonemasons, or carpenters, so craftsmen were essential for the village's stable development. I know, carpenters and stonemasons might not be a pressing matter, but a blacksmith was a must. Otherwise, ordinary farmers wouldn't have enough tools. He couldn't rely on Laura going home to buy them, could he? Thinking about it, a small number of people would be acceptable, but too many would be impossible. Ultimately, the outcome would depend on how many people he could recruit. It would be great if we could recruit 100 or so people in one go. In that case, they could even plan and build Winter Village like Winter Town, but David knew that was impossible. First, the world's population wasn't large enough to be easily recruited with just a few words. Second, many pioneers had fled back to Iron Tree Keep, and word of Winter Village's situation had probably spread there. Perhaps many wouldn't believe David's words. Haha, there's no need to rush. As long as the village develops steadily, the population will gradually increase. Fording felt he had plenty of experience in this area. After all, he was once the lord of the Kingdom of Tiran, governing a vast swath of land. As long as there's no war or other disasters. War? Probably not. David felt that war was too far away from Winter Village. His village lay at the northernmost tip of the Kingdom of Tiran, which was the northernmost power on the entire continent. This northernmost didn't just refer to the human kingdom, but to all the races on the continent. Before David established Winter Village, the plains north of the Tiran Mountains and Ironwood Forest lacked any true nation or even a town. This meant that the only real threats to David's Winter Village were small-scale troll villages like the one recently destroyed by Fording. Beyond that, the only truly significant power was the elves living in the Ironwood Forest. As for the possibility of war between the Kingdom of Tiran and other nations impacting Winter Village, the likelihood is low. First, Winter Village is newly established, and there are only a few registered able-bodied men, specifically, David alone, with the remaining few from other worlds. If war were to break out and a nationwide call for men were needed, no one would be available. Even if a call-up were issued, David would likely handle it alone. Furthermore, according to the Development Act, the kingdom generally does not issue calls for conscription to newly established villages unless in emergencies. Winter Village hasn't even been officially established yet, many processes remain to be completed. In this environment, as long as David didn't provoke the elves in the Ironwood Forest, Winter Village was essentially safe from the threat of war. Of course, being safe from threats didn't mean absolute safety, nor did it mean David had given up on improving his arms. He could never let his sword fall. Only with a sharp sword could he face any threat with ease. He understood this principle in his last life, and he never forgot it in this one. They stopped along the way, picking wild vegetables, mushrooms, and fruits. This trip not only eliminated potential threats, but also replenished their food supplies. Returning to Winter Village, they discovered that Mark had not returned to the Mars base, but had instead cultivated a small field outside the village. "What are you doing?" Mark was wiping sweat off his shovel with his arm as David and Fording approached. Seeing their clothes were clean, he knew the trolls hadn't troubled them. He didn't even ask about the battle, but answered David's question directly. "Laura brought some wheat and corn seeds. I'll try planting them." Wheat also grew in this world, but the wheat seeds brought by the pioneering team over the past 2 years hadn't been successful, so David hadn't considered planting wheat or barley. But Mark was willing to try, and he had no reason to object. Perhaps the seeds Laura had provided would adapt to this oil and climate here? Or maybe the changes he'd felt in the land weren't just an illusion? It wouldn't hurt to try. "Aren't you going to try Mars? It's just a small plot of land to plant wheat. It won't take much time." Mark now has enough food and plenty of rest. With his physical strength guaranteed, he can do whatever he wants. He doesn't mind wasting a little energy. "Once the Mars base is ready, I'm going to try growing some vegetables. By then, with all kinds of fresh vegetables, wheat-made pasta, tons of potatoes, and a variety of meats, Winter Village will truly have the freedom to eat." Thinking of that scene, David was filled with anticipation. Chapter 19. No money. What a shame. If only I could speed things up like in some games, or use some kind of power-up to see the results immediately. No matter how much David wished Winter Village would soon be free to eat, he could only wait day by day for the results. Compared to Mark Watney, who ran back and forth between the two camps, David's days were much easier. Besides occasionally exploring the forests to the north to check for any other dangerous neighbors, his main focus was training and studying. This training focused on the use of various weapons and combat techniques. Fording, in addition to being his teacher, also served as a sparring partner, but it wasn't a pleasant experience for David. He continued to study various subjects without interruption, and David felt that this learning process could continue for a long time. According to his own thinking, catch up on all this chaotic knowledge was simply not something he could accomplish in a few years. A few days later, Mark Watney finally successfully cultivated a potato field on the Mars base. Now, he just had to wait and see. With Winter Village as his backing, he felt less pressure about this purely experimental project. Of course, he still hoped for success. If he could grow potatoes on Mars, he'd be a first. "You know what? Maybe I'll be called the first human to colonize Mars." Mark often mentioned this during meals. Compared to the wheat sprouting in Winter Village, it was nothing to be astonished. "There's something I don't quite understand." Over time, Fording's English improved rapidly, and he could now communicate quite well. Because he'd learned English from Mark, his accent and speaking habits were more American. Why go to a planet where there's nothing, where it's not even habitable? Fording reasoned that even if Earth was overpopulated and needed a new home, shouldn't they choose a world where people could live? But from Mark's description, Mars didn't seem like a good place for a new home. Well, because it's very difficult for Earthlings to leave Earth and travel to other planets, Mars is the best choice. Mark casually introduced Fording to several other major planets in the solar system and reiterated the significance of his experiment's success. It seemed humans could potentially live on Mars. As Mark and Fording talked, David played a fighting game with Laura. Laura brought in a steady stream of electronic gadgets, including generators and solar panels. Watching David's character being easily defeated by her own, Laura gave him a meaningful look. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." Laura gripped the controller and started another game, talking about something completely unrelated to the game in front of her. "When are you leaving?" David's next plan was to travel to Iron Tree Keep, report the situation in Winter Village, and obtain Kingdom certification. Everyone knew this. If David hadn't wanted to see if Mark's wheat could sprout, he would have set off a few days ago after destroying the troll village. "We'll set off tomorrow morning." Now that he had the results and confirmed that wheat was ready for planting, he felt he had more leverage to recruit villagers. His only concern was that the rumors spread by the pioneers who had returned earlier might undermine his credibility. Iron Tree Fort is a big city, right? Iron Tree Fort is the largest city in the northern part of the Kingdom of Tiran. As a major northern city and the kingdom's primary source of high-quality timber, Iron Tree Fort holds a high status in Tiran. Thanks to the ironwood timber, Iron Tree Fort itself is quite prosperous. Of course, in the eyes of David, who had seen the world, it was just so-so, and still couldn't escape the impression of being dirty and messy. "Why? Are you interested in Iron Tree Fort?" "Of course, I'm interested in many things in this world. Laura frequently traveled to this world, practically treating it as her new home. It was an unexplored new world, full of unknowns. Her innate desire for exploration made her eager to discover everything about it and understand it thoroughly. So, David guessed what she was thinking when Laura's voice suddenly rose. "You're going with me?" "Yes. I've made some preparations." "Huh? Preparations?" "Yes, like clothes that better suit the style of this world." Laura paused the game and hurried back to her room. When she reappeared before David, she was holding a dress and pants similar to the one David had worn back then. "You're really well prepared." David had dug out some old clothes over the past few days and even camouflaged his backpack and bow with animal for Mark and Fording paused their galactic science presentation after noticing David and Laura discussing the journey to Iron Tree Keep. "How long will it take to get to Iron Tree Keep from here, if everything goes smoothly?" "More than half a month at most." The journey from Iron Tree Keep to this place took 2 months, but that was due to the large group and the slow pace. With just David and Laura, they could walk much faster. David estimated that if nothing unexpected happened, it would take between half a month and 20 days. It's a shame the village didn't leave any livestock. Even having some animals to carry food, let alone a horse, would have made the journey much more comfortable. For now, David and Laura could only carry extra compressed food and follow the river, using the stream flowing out of the ironwood forest as their primary source of food. Speaking of which, it seems we need to buy some livestock in addition to recruiting villagers. David then remembered that for the village to thrive, various livestock were also essential, and if possible, some poultry. After a few words of discussion, Mark suddenly became curious. "After all this talk, it suddenly occurred to me, does the village have money?" The scene fell silent. Several people present hadn't considered this question before, and all three eyes turned to David. Only he could answer this question. "No," David answered succinctly, looking at the three people staring at him. "Actually, the pioneering team makes all the necessary preparations before setting out. Once the village is successfully established, life continues as normal." He explained the situation to the three. That is, under normal circumstances, things like livestock, seeds for various crops, farm tools, and poultry are all prepared when the team is formed. If there are any subsequent needs, the village will have to find a way on its own. For example, they'd sell the food they produce, the fine furs they hunt, the minerals they find, and use the proceeds to purchase their own needs. Under normal circumstances, that's how it should be, but David's situation wasn't normal. His winter village had essentially failed to establish itself. The resources they brought with them had been largely depleted. Although the village was now established and had food, it wasn't wealthy enough to support large-scale trade. "Then how will we buy poultry and livestock?" "I'll think of a solution once I get to Iron Tree Keep." David's idea was to see if those who agreed to come to Winter Village could bring some poultry or livestock with them. He wasn't concerned with the quantity, he'd just figure out if they had enough. As long as the foundation was established, the supply would surely increase as the village developed. Furthermore, he wondered if Iron Tree Keep would provide Winter Village with any support and assistance. Conventional wisdom held that once he became the mayor of Winter Village, the Lord of Iron Tree Keep would become his direct superior. As a subordinate, it was natural for David to ask his superior for material support. After briefly explaining his idea, Fording agreed, believing it to be feasible and sound. Mark lamented the timing. His Martian potato growing experiment was still in its infancy, and with a few plots of land in the village requiring care, he couldn't get away to explore the larger cities of this world. "Once we have enough people, you'll be able to wander around freely." However, David was worried about Mark's lack of self-defense skills. "Before that, you should improve your martial arts skills." "I will." Mark knew the world was full of dangers, and he wasn't planning on running around alone. "And I'm not planning on running out alone. Maybe after you come back this time, the next time you need to go to Iron Tree Fort, I can go with you." There will definitely be plenty of opportunities. Regardless of the final outcome, David was certain that he would be traveling back and forth between Winter Village and Iron Tree Fort frequently in the future. At this thought, he suddenly became curious. Speaking of which, there were 3 pioneering teams that set out from Iron Tree Fort. "I wonder what's happening with the other 2, huh?" 2 more pioneering teams. Hearing that there were 2 more teams as miserable as David's, Mark and Laura were equally curious about their situation. "One of the teams is building a village south of Winter Village, next to the Iron Tree Forest. We will pass by there on the way to Iron Tree Castle. If the village is built, we can replenish some supplies. However, including David, everyone present felt that the possibility of successfully building a village there was not great. Chapter 20 On the way to Iron Tree Castle. As a small pancake slowly emerged from the horizon, the sky gradually brightened. David, having already packed and eaten breakfast, shouldered his well-packed backpack. The backpack forced him to hold his hunting bow in his hand, allowing him to react quickly in the event of danger. Laura's backpack was much smaller than David's, allowing her to hang her bow from the outside, eliminating the need to hold it separately and providing easy access. Besides her bow and arrows, Laura carried 2 mountaineering picks on her waist, while David had a hand axe tucked into his. This was their superficial armament. They also carried a pistol hidden beneath their clothes, and Laura had a shotgun tucked into the side of her backpack. Since David was already an accomplished holy light priest, their safety was guaranteed. After bidding farewell to Fording and Mark, David and Laura set off for Iron Tree Keep. An hour later, walking along the river, on the emerald green grass emitting a delicate fragrance, Laura felt this trip felt more like a picnic, a spring outing. It would be even more so if the backpack wasn't so heavy. Just think of it as a picnic. Staying in the village all the time is boring. Not only Laura, who never rested, but even David was beginning to get tired, especially during the past 2 years when there was almost no hope. It was only in the last few months, with its comfort and hope, that David finally felt comfortable staying in the village. After walking and chatting for a long time, David had no idea how far they had gone, but he felt that at this rate, they would reach Iron Tree Fort sooner than he had expected. Both David and Laura were far more physically fit than the average person, and without the burden of a large group, their progress was quite rapid. After walking for nearly a day, David decided to stop and prepare for the night while the sun was still bright and clear before sunset. Let's rest here for the night. David looked around. The terrain was very flat, with green grass as far as the eye could see. There was little shelter from the wind and rain, but there was a gravel beach by the river where they could start a fire. As for firewood, David chose to stop here precisely because there were a few unattractive, crooked trees nearby. Just chopping off a few branches, the thickness of a wrist, would be enough to get them through the night. I'm going to catch some fish in the river for dinner, Laura said, setting her backpack on the ground and walking with David toward the trees. But I need some tools. Watching Laura select a stick over a meter long and then sharpen one end with a dagger, David realized she was planning to use it to spear fish. Don't you have a hook? This is more convenient. Laura surveyed her work and nodded with satisfaction. I'll go catch some fish. David nodded in understanding and continued to gather firewood. Focused on his task, he quickly completed it, gathered enough wood, and returned to the temporary campsite they had chosen. A bonfire had been built on the gravel beach, along with 2 pre-cooked fish, placed not far from it. Laura, David glanced around, but couldn't see Laura. Could she still be in the river? Walking a few steps toward the river, David spotted Laura's clothes, shoes, and socks, carelessly discarded there. Another shout followed. Before David could decide whether to look elsewhere or return to the fire to roast a fish, the sound of water echoed from directly in front of him. Laura emerged from the river, wiped her face, and excitedly greeted David. The water's so comfortable. After a day's walk, why don't you take a bath? It sounded like a tempting suggestion, especially since the one extending it was the renowned Laura. In her previous life, she was a world-renowned adventurer, the goddess of countless hearts, and perennially at the top of search rankings on certain websites, steadily surpassing the other goddess known as the Holy City. What? Are you shy? Laura swam closer to the shore, carefully studying David's expression, finding it quite amusing. How could that be? David defended himself with a serious face. I just didn't bring a swimsuit. Laura smiled and winked at David. Me neither. A splash. A beautiful splash of water. David and Laura must have had a rough trip, didn't they? Mark ate a plate of hot stew with a plate of pasta. A TV show played on his laptop on the table. Of course, Laura had brought it. Sitting next to Mark, Fording had already finished his stew. Still hungry, he didn't get up to get another. Instead, he sat back and watched Band of Brothers with Mark. David has walked all the way to this place before, so it's not unfamiliar to him. After a moment, Fording answered Mark's question. Laura has also had experience traveling in the wild. But the journey must have been rough. The once plump fish lay on the gravel, watching helplessly as it gradually withered away, reduced to a mere skeleton, before being completely abandoned. Its wide eyes seemed to accuse the man and woman next to it, but unfortunately, neither man nor woman was paying any attention to it, frantically fighting for the last bit of fish in each other's mouths. In the fierce battle, the last piece of fish was completely destroyed. Neither of them knew who would win in the end, or perhaps both were victorious. I knew you'd been coveting me for a long time. Laura's actions were clearly premeditated. David looked up at the twinkling stars in the night sky and sighed. Boys really have to protect themselves when they're out there, especially a handsome and strong boy like me. Laura rolled her eyes at David's irritating expression and scoffed. I don't see how you look like a child. She glanced at the clothes thrown by the fire. Their soaking wet clothes had long since dried. She turned over and looked up at the sky. The night sky here is so beautiful. David didn't respond, simply spreading his arms as a pillow and covering Laura with clothes from the side. When I'm home, I can't see such a beautiful starry sky at night. The conditions for seeing a star-filled night sky in the modern world are far too harsh. Living in the city or even the suburbs, it's impossible to see so many stars. David said nothing, just listened quietly. Unexpectedly, Laura's next words gave him a start. You probably feel similarly, don't you? Huh? Why do you say that? David feigned innocence. Laura turned to glance at David, only to be met with an innocent face and pure eyes. If his hands were just as pure, Laura might have believed him. But Laura didn't dwell on the topic any further, perhaps believing that forcing an answer, whether true or false, would be pointless. Since David didn't want to talk now, then maybe later. Closing his eyes, an incredibly tiring day ended. Seeing Laura fall asleep, David closed his own. When he opened them again, it was already bright daylight, the sun already high in the sky. Since they needed some time to get ready, it was almost noon by the time they set out again. We should have set an alarm. Laura thought waking up a little late would slow their journey, but David didn't see the problem. He'd used so much energy yesterday, and more rest would be necessary to recover. Forcing a journey without sufficient energy would not only prevent them from covering much distance, but also put them at risk of injury. I'm very strong. Laura struck a bodybuilding pose as she walked, trying to show off her biceps, which could kill a cow with a single punch. Then, she glanced at David, a strange smile crossing her face. Could it be, don't you know my physical fitness? Aside from being a hunter who made a living by hunting wild beasts, David's physical fitness had been constantly improving since learning the ways of the holy light from Fording. Now, with just his bare hands, he could beat his former self from just a few months ago. Even so, he saw no end in sight. Blessed by the holy light, his improvement seemed limitless, as long as he was willing to train tirelessly. If he kept up this training, he suspected he would soon have a body of steel, even if it was a bankrupt one. Speaking of the holy light, I envy you for mastering it so quickly. Laura had also studied holy light knowledge with Fording, but like Mark, although she understood the ways of the holy light, she still hadn't received its favor. Did she have to practice those things, as Fording said, in order to gain its approval? But even if she wanted to help those in need, no one needed her help right now. The one in the most difficulty was David, the one she had truly helped. If only you could share some of your holy light with me. What? I mean, if only you could share some of your holy light with me. Laura assumed David hadn't heard clearly, given their continued journey. I want to experience what it's like to possess mystical power, too. Although she had experienced the effects of support spells like Holy Shield, spells not cast by her own only made her marvel at their effectiveness. David paused, pondering Laura's words. It doesn't seem impossible, huh? Laura's words were merely a casual remark, but she hadn't expected David to actually entertain such a thought. Are you serious? Is there a problem? Probably not. David pondered carefully, confirming that his idea carried no risks, as there was a group in Azeroth that used the holy light in the same way. Before arriving in this world, David had commanded his Blood Elf Paladin to search for inauspicious locations across Azeroth. However, we need to study the specific operation carefully. We will try it after we return from Iron Tree Fort. Chapter 21 Northern Outpost. After 4 days of trekking, David and Laura finally reached the edge of the Ironwood Forest. Gazing at the narrowing river and the shattered remains of houses, David threw up his hands in frustration. Clearly, this pioneering team has failed. The numerous wooden houses here, all individual dwellings, not large, makeshift structures, seemed to indicate a smooth initial development. However, this didn't change the fact that the area was in ruins. The condition of the wreckage suggested the village had been abandoned for a long time. Simply abandoning wouldn't have left the houses in their current state, not a single intact one, and all clearly damaged by fire. A pioneering team would burn down every house before abandoning and leaving, Laura wondered. What was the point? No, they just pack up anything valuable and leave. David walked around the abandoned village several times before finally finding a clue beneath a wooden house near the forest. What's this? Laura looked around frantically. Seeing David squat and pick something up, she immediately leaned over to take a look. She found David holding a broken arrow shaft. An arrow? The arrow shaft in his hand wasn't complete, only half, but the real clue lay there. It's an elven arrow. How do you tell? Only the elves of the Ironwood Forest use this special leaf to make their arrow fletchings. Laura briefly explained that this leaf can only be found deep within the Ironwood Forest, where the elves primarily live. It's difficult for humans to reach those areas, let alone collect them in large quantities. Given its difficulty in obtaining and the fact that it's not an irreplaceable material, humans naturally wouldn't choose this leaf for their arrow fletchings. Only the elves, who have easier access to it, would use it. So that's how it is. Furthermore, ever since the Kingdom of Tiran expanded its influence into the Ironwood Forest, relations between humans, primarily those of the kingdom, and the elves of the Ironwood Forest have plummeted. The elves see the widespread logging of the Ironwood Forest as tantamount to aggression. The elf's striking appearance often attracted the attention and capture of slave traders. For these various reasons, the relationship between humans and elves wasn't necessarily a life or death struggle, but one would inevitably fall. Under these circumstances, it was natural for the elves of the Ironwood Forest to discover a human village had appeared north of their homeland and launch an attack. So, this village was destroyed by the elves. That's quite possible. Thinking of this, David couldn't help but feel fortunate that his initial choice was truly a wise one. When he joined the pioneering team, it was decided from the outset that 3 villages would be established, meaning 3 teams. However, all 3 teams set out together. The main force departed from Ironwood Castle, advancing north along a flat path between the Ironwood Forest and the Tilan Mountains. Once they emerged from this narrow passage, they arrived at the Tilan Kingdom's northern outpost. This was a now abandoned outpost, originally established as Tilan's northernmost outpost to prevent attacks on Ironwood Castle from forces on the vast plains to the north. After establishing the outpost, they discovered that no powerful forces existed on the entire northern plains. The northern outpost seemed to have lost its purpose, and the troops and funding were gradually reduced until it was completely abolished. Therefore, upon arriving at the outpost, the pioneering force did not stop there but split into 2 groups. 1/3 headed northeast along the Tiran Mountains, while the remaining group headed west along the northern side of the Ironwood Forest. After reaching the spot where David now stood, half of the group remained to establish a village, while the remaining group continued north along the river. Laura clearly understood what happened next. Winter Village was established, but David was the only one left. Judging from the outcome of that village, it might be difficult for the group heading northeast to successfully establish a village. David wasn't cursing those people, but rather that the climate across the vast plains was similar. David had searched around but couldn't find any cultivated farmland, indicating that the land conditions were similar. Without cheat codes or other hacks, the 2 pioneering teams faced a similar situation to their own 2 years ago: a cold climate, inability to survive crops, a lack of stable food supply, and particularly harsh winters. Furthermore, his village faced a threat from the elves of the Ironwood Forest. He'd initially chosen to follow the last group northward, fearing they were too close to the elves. To avoid a sudden attack from the elves, he'd chosen to follow the last group. Now it seemed like a wise decision. Listening to David's story, Laura gained a better understanding of Ironwood Castle and the entire northern plains. If the group heading northeast also fails to establish a village, then this vast plain could be considered your territory. David hadn't considered that before, but recalling the various laws and regulations regarding pioneers in the Kingdom of Tiran, he realized it wasn't impossible. Within the kingdom, village chiefs, town mayors, and even noble lords all had fixed territories, as their territories bordered those of their colleagues. Unless Tiran's rule collapsed and it descended into civil war, no lord within the kingdom would be allowed to invade or plunder the territories of another. But pioneering teams were different. They were meant to conquer territory outside the kingdom, taking as much as they could. As long as they could control it, the kingdom would recognize it as their territory and even raise their lordship accordingly. Village chiefs became town chiefs became city lords, and city lords became great lords. Titles were also awarded based on contributions. This was all written into the decree, and the rise and prosperity of the Kingdom of Tiran could be traced back to this decree. Including Iron Tree Fort, most of Tiran's territory was acquired through this process. However, this plain is too vast. Making the entire area my domain won't be easy. At least Winter Village would have to become Winter City to establish the foundation. Oh what? Laura's strange reaction puzzled David. Did he say something wrong? It seems you truly desire to become lord of this place. David's words proved he had considered it, otherwise, he wouldn't have considered it. If I could become a great lord, would I be content with being a small village chief? David's decision to join the pioneering team, rather than remain a hunter in Iron Tree Keep, revealed his true intentions. Despite living in this world for many years, the influence of his past life had long since etched itself deeply within his soul. Even if he succumbed to the pressures of reality, given the slightest opportunity, he would choose a more comfortable lifestyle. So far, living his ideal life has become much easier than he initially anticipated. After a brief rest in the ruins, David and Laura didn't wait for sunrise to set out. As soon as daylight broke, they headed east through the Iron Tree Forest. They would follow the northern edge of the Iron Tree Forest to the junction of the Tiran Mountains and the Iron Tree Forest, then turn south and continue along the passageway until they finally reached Iron Tree Keep. They had to move as quickly as possible, as this section of the journey was more treacherous than the previous one. Actually, I'm very curious about the elves. It would be great if I could see them in person. Maybe we could have some good communication with them. You'll see them when we get to Iron Tree Keep. As for this part of the journey, it's best not to encounter any elves at all. That's definitely not fun. Although David didn't explain it clearly, Laura understood the considerable information contained in his words. The elves in Iron Tree Keep probably didn't live there voluntarily. The relationship between the humans and elves in Iron Tree Keep couldn't be worse, so it was best to avoid encountering the forest elves. Whether it was because David and Laura had deliberately kept a sufficient distance from the Iron Tree Forest, avoiding the attention of the elves, or perhaps they had noticed but hadn't found the right moment to strike, the journey was uneventful and uneventful. What really surprised David was that upon arriving at the long-abandoned northern outpost, a small group of soldiers appeared. What's going on? Because David and Laura both looked perfectly human, after the initial nervousness wore off, the soldiers at the outpost didn't bother them. After confirming that David was part of the pioneering team that had departed from Iron Tree Keep, the soldier looked surprised. Are there still any pioneers who haven't returned to Iron Tree Keep yet? Because I've successfully established Winter Village, I'm returning to Iron Tree Keep to report. David's response surprised the soldier even more. But then David showed his pioneering order, which didn't look fake. The soldier, unsure how to greet the two, called out to his captain. Hello, I'm Captain Gregory, in charge of the northern outpost. A middle-aged man, fully armored and wearing the Tiran Kingdom's battle robe, appeared before David and Laura. Are you from the pioneering team in the northwest? Yes, although our pioneering team encountered many difficulties, many dropped out, and many died on these plains, we finally succeeded in establishing the new village, Winter Village. I'm going to Iron Tree Keep to report on the progress and officially make Winter Village part of the kingdom. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 22 Iron Tree Fort. Captain Gregory examined David's pioneering order. He couldn't actually confirm its authenticity, but that wasn't his job. As for the security mission, their squad, restationed at the northern outpost, wasn't really meant to be guarding against humans. This was the main reason David and Laura were allowed inside without questioning. I can't believe a team actually built a village to the north. I've heard from those who've abandoned the area how horrible the conditions are on these plains. Gregory, in charge of the northern outpost, naturally needed to be well informed about the area. Isn't it said that the land on these plains can't grow food? We're lucky we found a wild crop that can be grown. David pulled a few potatoes from his backpack. He and Laura had brought some, not as food, but as a token of their appreciation. Want to try some? They're quite delicious, a newfound crop. Gregory took the potatoes, examined them, and sniffed them. They looked like something quite good. But necessary caution prevented him from rashly agreeing. Instead, he returned the potatoes to David, giving it perfectly reasonable reason. You're going to show these to someone, right? Don't waste them here, that's good. They're easy to grow. If Captain Gregory stays here long term, he'll definitely get a chance to taste them in the future. David put the potatoes away. Captain Gregory's caution was completely understandable. If someone wasn't incredibly cautious, they wouldn't be stationed at a border outpost. He then inquired about the reopening of this long-abandoned outpost. Actually, it's related to the pioneering team, Gregory briefly explained, finally clarifying what had happened and the main reason for the reopening of the northern outpost. Things were consistent with David's earlier assumptions. The pioneering team heading northeast had indeed failed to establish a village, and in fact, abandoned their village earlier than the one heading west. The reason for this group's abandonment, besides the harsh living conditions, was an attack. According to the survivors, they were attacked by a strange race, taller and stronger than humans. They had brown and ochre skin and enormous fangs. As David listened to Gregory's description, an image slowly formed in his mind, and the more he listened, the more he felt he was talking about orcs. Orcs existed in this world? He had never heard of them before, but that wasn't a valid assumption. After all, David was just a young hunter, so his limited experience was understandable. However, judging by Gregory's description and reaction, the captain also didn't know anything about orcs. David didn't interrupt, but listened quietly. After all, his judgment wasn't guaranteed to be correct. Perhaps it was a creature similar to the giant monster he had encountered earlier? The northeastern pioneer camp was attacked and destroyed, and the survivors fled back to Iron Tree Keep and reported the situation. Upon learning of the existence of such a force on the northern plains, Iron Tree Keep sent soldiers to investigate. They discovered that this completely unknown race had established a village in the same spot where the pioneers had been stationed, seemingly intending to settle permanently. At this point, Iron Tree Keep remained unconcerned. After all, pioneering teams weren't always successful. Countless teams throughout history had been destroyed by various forces, even ferocious monsters. This particular team's demise wasn't worthy of undue concern. But then another team failed. While their failure to establish a village this time was largely due to the harsh environment, the elven attacks were also a significant factor. Considering the elves' hostility toward Iron Tree Keep took it a step further. Gregory led a small team to station at Northwatch. This seemed odd, considering the Iron Tree Forest bordered Iron Tree Keep, and Northwatch was located northeast of it. Even if they were concerned about elven attacks, restoring Northwatch didn't seem necessary. David pondered this carefully, realizing that restoring Northwatch wasn't about guarding against the elves, but rather monitoring the entire northern plains. The elves and the humans of Iron Tree Keep were neighbors, and friction between the two sides was constant, so Iron Tree Keep's vigilance against the elves never waned. If a conflict with the elves erupted and a third force suddenly attacked from the north, Iron Tree Keep would be vulnerable. That's why they stationed a team here, primarily to warn Iron Tree Keep of an attack and give it time to mobilize its forces. Therefore, only a small force was deployed. After learning why the northern outpost had been reactivated, David's thoughts drifted to the mysterious force to the northeast. Do they think my start was too easy? Are they assigning me an opponent? If you were playing a farming game, this sudden enemy would be his primary initial competitor. As for the trolls at his doorstep, that's just a tutorial for beginners. I wasn't in a rush at first, thinking a slow development would be fine, but now it seems a bit faster is best. According to David's original plan, growing the village to the size of a town within a few years would be considered a major success. As for going further, transforming Winter Village into Winter City? That would likely take many more years. The most crucial issue is population. Population growth is no easy task, and the Iron Tree Keep region isn't that populous. If only we could bring some people in from elsewhere. Laura and Mark didn't discuss this. As long as Fordring could bring people from Azeroth, population wouldn't be a problem for David. The reason was simple. Fordring's exile and seclusion meant that the world wasn't far off from the events of Warcraft III. In that story, Arthas Menethil, the former prince of Lordaeron, who became a Death Knight, led the Scourge across the Eastern Kingdoms, bringing devastation to countless nations and civilians. Despite the Scourge's immense power and terrifying power, many Lordaeronians managed to survive the catastrophe, becoming refugees without a home. Not to mention the many elves of Quel'Thalas, who were not only skilled mages but also top hunters. If David could lend a hand to Azeroth's multinational refugees at this time, it would be a win-win for both sides. What a shame. Without dwelling on it for long, David quickly put the matter aside and focused on the task at hand. After a night's rest at the northern outpost, David and Laura left the outpost early the next morning and headed towards Iron Tree Fort along the road between the Tiran Mountains and the Iron Tree Forest. The journey wasn't safe either, as the Iron Tree Forest lay nearby, and the elves could swarm out and launch a surprise attack at any moment. Therefore, Laura and David tried to travel as fast as possible, remaining vigilant during their nights to ensure safety. After a total of 13 days of trekking, Laura and David finally arrived outside Iron Tree Fort, 2 days faster than they had anticipated. Is this Iron Tree Fort? Laura gazed at the towering walls ahead, somewhat surprised that its defenses seemed far stronger than she had imagined. No, this is just the northern pass, David explained. Due to the poor relationship with the elves and their initial wariness of the vast lands to the north, Iron Tree Fort had constructed a pass along this northern passage when it was first built. This pass, connected to the western fortress walls, served as its outer defenses. More than half of Iron Tree Fort's forces were stationed in the pass and the northwest fort, commanded by Ismail Sosa, the most trusted knight of Iron Tree Fort's lord, Marcus Dudley Morgan. After crossing the pass, it was still a while before reaching Iron Tree Fort's outer city. The outer city was Iron Tree Fort's civilian district. After the establishment of Iron Tree Fort's core area, countless ordinary people who migrated from the area settled around Iron Tree Fort, gradually forming a large residential area. Soon after, various shops catering to these common people emerged, eventually becoming Iron Tree Fort's outer city. The outer city was vast, but completely unplanned, with uneven construction quality. The entire outer city was synonymous with chaos and squalor. Even from a distance, Laura could already smell its unpleasant odor. Oh, my goodness, that smell! David couldn't help but smirk. He had expected Laura to react this way, but seeing it in person was completely different from what he had imagined. Seeing it in person was even more interesting. As the distance closed, Laura's eyes began to narrow, and the details of the outer city came into view. The outer city lacked walls, allowing it to expand. Though she had long known that living conditions in backward civilizations were poor, seeing them firsthand felt like a fresh refreshment. I suddenly understand why you joined a pioneering team, Laura said, trying to breathe through her mouth, but the constant influx of smells made her wonder if her thinking was starting to take a toll. Well, that's one of the reasons. Instead of leading Laura into the city, David turned south a distance away. I'll take you to see someone. We can stay with him tonight and then go into the city tomorrow. Noticing Laura's hesitation, David offered reassurance. Don't worry, his place is a bit more secluded, it's a bit better. Chapter 23 The Old Hunter and the Young Hunter. Although Laura was skeptical of David's claim of a better environment, she didn't object, as she was curious about the person David was taking her to. Cleverly, she guessed that David was meeting the old hunter, Artis, who had raised and trained him as a hunter. After walking around the outer city of Iron Tree Fort for a while, they gradually saw scattered houses ahead. David explained that Iron Tree Fort had built a fort in the northwest, threatening the elves of the Iron Tree Forest. Consequently, after Iron Tree Fort reached a certain level of development, the civilian population no longer settled in that direction. Later, civilians who settled in Iron Tree Fort tended to settle south, where there were more than 3 times as many buildings as the west, resulting in a larger civilian population. A smaller number settled in the southwest, but for various reasons, this direction was much less populated. The defensive fort primarily protected the area directly facing the Iron Tree Forest, as the pass blocked the road to the north. While the west could also provide adequate protection, the southwest of Iron Tree Fort was relatively vulnerable, being closer to the Iron Tree Forest, and living there carried certain risks. Generally speaking, woodcutters and hunters live in this area. This direction made it easy for them to access the nearby forest for firewood and game. Did you live here before? Yes, because the population was sparse, unlike the outer city we'd seen earlier, where houses were packed together almost side by side. There was also much less household garbage, so the environment was relatively better. After walking for a while, David and Laura stopped outside a wooden house. Compared to the houses they had seen before, this one looked much neater and cleaner. It even had a fenced-in yard planted with various flowers, the fragrance of which greatly alleviated the various unpleasant odors in the air. Is this the place? It's a nice environment indeed. Laura looked surprised. She had expected the man she was about to meet, Adis, to be a bearded, unkempt man. As a hunter, he might have a house full of furs or freshly killed carcasses. In any case, she hadn't expected such a scene. In fact, Laura wasn't the only one surprised. David was also a little puzzled. How had the place changed so much after being away for over 2 years? He glanced around, making sure he had found the right place. Aside from the flowers and plants in the yard, everything else was exactly as he remembered. Could it be, the old tree blossomed? The old bachelor finally found his partner? It seemed inconvenient to just barge in, so he stood outside the yard and called out, "Adis, I'm David. I've come back to see you." His usual temper would have necessitated some cordial greetings, but now he deleted them. He soon realized he might have been mistaken. The wooden door opened, and out stepped not a woman, but a short, thin child. Standing at the doorway, he sized David up. "Adis went hunting in the forest. There's more than one iron tree forest surrounding Iron Tree Castle this morning and hasn't returned yet. I'm David. Did Adis tell you about me?" Seeing the child, David immediately understood what was going on. It seemed Adis had adopted another child. A closer look revealed the child to be quite thin, with a handsome, fair complexion and delicate skin, unlikely to be found in such a place. A bandage tied around his head made David suspect the child was injured and recuperating at home. Based on his experience, Adis would normally take the child with him when he went hunting, teaching him how to be a competent hunter. "Yes, I've heard him mention you." As the beautiful child and David were conversing, an old hunter with a full, white beard slowly approached and began barking from a distance. "Alfie, didn't I tell you to stay inside?" The child, Alfie, was startled, taking a half step back as if he had done something wrong. He murmured, "I only opened the door because he said his name was David." "He said he was David, didn't he? You're so foolish. I can't imagine how you're going to survive in the future." The old hunter's roar, undimmed by Alfie's defense, grew even louder. "Hey," David on the side noticed that something might be wrong here. Although Adis's temper was not very good before, he was not so irritable. Moreover, although his tone was not good, the concern in his words was very obvious. It seemed that the identity of this child was not simple. "Old man, besides your temper getting worse, your eyesight is getting worse and worse. Can't you recognize me?" Adis had already walked in front of David, and casually threw the hare and pheasant in his hand into the yard, looking at David face to face. "Although you have changed a lot, your expression that really deserves a beating remains the same." He opened his arms and hugged David. "I inquired about the situation of the pioneer team, and thought you would never come back. I won't die that easily." David opened his arms and hugged Adis, and at the same time patted the old hunter on the back. "Aren't you still counting on me to take care of you in your old age?" Adis smiled happily after loosening his arms. "So, after you come back this time, you plan to be a hunter honestly in Iron Tree Castle?" In Adis's opinion, David, like the pioneers before him, should have chosen to give up and return to his original life. Adis considered this a more practical choice. As for why David, who always seemed to be on a quest for great things, chose to give up, it might have something to do with a woman accompanying him. Men, once they have responsibilities, stop dwelling on unrealistic things. "What's your name, young lady?" "Lara Croft, just call me Laura." Laura had been learning the common language of this world. Thanks to her extraordinary talent for languages, she had long since mastered the language. "Lara Croft." Adis's face showed a hint of surprise. He carefully examined the woman before him and easily noticed Laura's peculiarity. He said nothing, but warmly invited them inside to discuss. Adis's home was also a wooden house. Compared to David's newly built cabins in Winter Village, this one was significantly larger and more complex, with several separate rooms. The spacious living room, furnished with a wooden table and several chairs, was surrounded by cabinets and racks for weapons and game. David surveyed the room, finding it largely unchanged from when he'd left. He set his backpack and bow aside, and after Laura had unpacked and taken a seat, David noticed Alfie in the kitchen preparing the game that Adis had dumped into the yard. He occasionally cast curious glances at David. David smiled back and turned to explain to Adis that he was not giving up his pioneer identity and returning to Iron Tree Castle to be a hunter. "Although the pioneering team I was in encountered many difficulties, we finally succeeded in establishing the village." "Oh? Success?" As a native of the Kingdom of Tiran, Adis certainly understood what it meant to successfully build a village. But I heard from those who came back before that the environment in the north is very bad and it is impossible to build a village. I'm lucky. After taking over the position of village chief, I found a wild crop. Now I have begun to reclaim fields and plant this crop on a large scale. Wait, you just said that you took over the position of village chief. What about discovering new crops and starting large-scale planting? These are nothing. What really shocked Addis is that David actually became the village chief. At the same time, he also understood what David was doing back to Iron Tree Castle this time. So, you came back this time. This time I came back to make Winter Village an official territory of the kingdom. Hearing David say what he wanted to say but couldn't believe, Addis was so shocked that he straightened his back and leaned back. At the same time, he reached for the small kettle hanging at his waist, opened the lid, and took several sips before calming down. This joke is not funny at all, I'm not kidding. David looked directly at Addis, who stared at David with wide eyes, as if trying to find some flaw in David's face. The two men stared at each other for over a minute before Addis finally sighed first, breaking the deadlock. It's actually true. This is hard to believe. You actually did it. Shaking his head, Addis took another long bite, a blush rising on his face and neck. Congratulations, thank you. Addis turned to Alfie in the kitchen and called out, make that rabbit and pheasant dinner to celebrate David becoming village chief. Okay, Alfie's voice echoed from the kitchen. David glanced at the child still toiling away in the kitchen, remembering his past. Is this child my successor? David thought it wasn't surprising that Addis, after learning about the Pioneer team's situation, had assumed he wouldn't be able to return, and therefore sought out a new successor. He had long known that the old hunter adopted children and trained them to be hunters, ensuring someone would care for him and provide for his retirement when he could no longer hunt. But when David turned the topic to the child, Addis's expression became strange, as if he was hesitant to say something. Is there any trouble? No, nothing. Addis obviously hesitated for a few seconds, but in the end he didn't say anything. However, David noticed that Addis glanced at Laura several times while he was hesitating, and seemed to be very wary of Laura. Chapter 24 Half-Elf. After a sumptuous dinner, Addis gave his bedroom to Laura, while he and David settled for the night in the living room. Being a hunter did offer some advantages. For example, Addis had a large collection of animal furs. These were often flawed, with garbled colors or unattractive patterns, and they wouldn't fetch a high price or be easily sold, so they were usually stored there. For a skilled hunter, there was no need to worry about lacking warm clothing and bedding in the winter. While these furs might not look good, they offered no real warmth. Addis and David made a mat out of the furs and lay down to rest. The common people of this world didn't have much evening entertainment. As soon as dusk fell, the outer city fell silent, with only the inner city lighting up. As a veteran hunter from the common class, Addis had long cultivated the habit of going to bed and waking up early. David had originally followed suit, but with the rapid changes in Winter Village, his routine had shifted slightly, and he hadn't gone to bed so early in a while. Close your eyes and contemplate the holy light. Standing up and assuming a prayer position would easily make him stand out, too conspicuous. David decided to simply ponder the theoretical knowledge of the way of the holy light. He didn't know how long it had passed before the snoring beside him stopped, followed by the sound of someone getting up. If it had been a normal nighttime awakening, it wouldn't have alarmed David. Instead, he noticed Addis standing up and quietly approaching. Opening his eyes, he happened to meet Addis's gaze. Seeing him raise his finger in a silent gesture, David nodded, then quietly stood up and followed Addis out of the house. After closing the door, Addis whispered, "Come for a walk with me." At this hour, David smiled, glancing around. The scattered houses were devoid of light or sound. Even in the inner city of Iron Tree Castle, which was located slightly higher, there weren't many lights. David knew that Addis had something confidential to share, and his words were simply a joke. Addis knew this, so he didn't respond, simply gesturing for David to follow. Addis's residence was located in the outermost area of Iron Tree Keep, a place with few houses to begin with. A short walk would essentially put him outside the keep. It's far enough, David observed. Further ahead lay a forest south of the Iron Tree Forest. While this forest also produced high-quality wood like ironwood, it was primarily populated by other species. Partially connected to the Iron Tree Forest, it presented a much lower risk to human hunters and woodcutters. Addis paused, glanced around, and decided they were far enough away. He looked at David with a serious expression. Isn't that Laura Croft a noble, huh? That, David hadn't expected Addis's first question to be this. I think so. Reflecting on Laurie's personal information, he remembered that in the original version, the Crofts were legitimate English earls. He had no idea about the new character design. He only knew that the Crawfords were a large family, presumably with a title, but he couldn't recall the specifics, and he hadn't asked Laurie about it. Don't tell me you can't tell. Addis flung his hand in dissatisfaction, as if about to say something but ultimately restrained himself. After a long hesitation, he managed to utter, "You shouldn't have brought her here. But this noble lady doesn't seem to mind the surroundings." David, observing Addis's displeased expression, guessed what was unsettling the old hunter. "Is it because of Alfie? Who is this child?" Addis didn't answer, still struggling with something. David suddenly said, "If that child truly has some special identity, then staying in Iron Tree Keep would be even more dangerous, wouldn't it? Haven't you considered taking him away with you?" "Leave? Where?" Addis replied instinctively, then froze. The old hunter had been born and raised in Iron Tree Keep, familiar with the area and its surroundings. If he left, he wouldn't know where to go. At the same time, he wasn't sure if he, already quite old, could still be a good hunter in a new place. Within 2 seconds of his words leaving his mouth, Addis realized. Was David suggesting he settle in his village? It seemed like a good option, but he ultimately shook his head. Alfie's situation is somewhat unique. Going to your place might not be the best option, so, what's going on with Alfie? David disliked this kind of guessing game. Can't you just speak up? He understood Addis might think it was pointless, but Addis didn't know David's situation well enough, and his judgment was inaccurate. Perhaps David could actually solve it? Could it be some heinous wanted criminal? Maybe a wanted criminal is better. David hadn't expected Addis to say that. Thinking of Alfie's slender figure, his pale skin that stood out against the civilian population, and his striking appearance, he asked, could that child be the child of someone with a special status? Addis finally gave his answer. That child is a half-elf. Half-elf? David had suspected the child was some noble's illegitimate child, sent to Addis for some reason, but he hadn't considered the possibility of an elf. After all, the relationship between humans and elves in Iron Tree Keep was incredibly poor. Given this poor relationship, David understood Addis's reaction. Why did you consider adopting a half-elf? Half-elves are a hybrid of human and elf. In Iron Tree Keep, half-elves are not uncommon, as elves have always been the most sought-after slave race among the nobility. Most of the half-elves in Iron Tree Keep were born under this circumstance. These human-elf hybrids were doomed to a dark and tragic life from birth, and neither humans nor elves considered half-elves their own. In the eyes of the humans of Iron Tree Keep, half-elves were mere slaves of lowly status, surpassing even the laziest, poorest outcasts in the outer boroughs. Their only advantage was their appearance, which rivaled that of the elves. This made half-elves a sought-after commodity in the slave market. In the eyes of the elves, these half-elves were born with sin. Extreme elves even saw them as a disgrace to the elves, slaying them on sight. More docile elves would expel them, leaving them virtually without a home. Perhaps the best outcome for this group was to be purchased by a less lenient noble. Alfie is, David wondered. How had Addis met Alfie? Why did he keep him? Could this child be Addis's? He hadn't realized the old man had such a talent. How could he have quietly taken a female elf? Could this be the real reason Addis hadn't married? David's thoughts drifted away, and his expression betrayed his thoughts perfectly. Addis didn't have to think twice before guessing what he was thinking. You, just like always, can't hide your feelings. Addis had repeatedly wondered if he'd been blind to adopt David. The boy's genuine disdain and contempt for everything and everyone around him had made him worry he wouldn't even reach adulthood, dying on the streets because he'd offended the city's dignitaries. It was precisely because of this concern that he didn't try to stop him when David expressed his desire to join the pioneering team. Addis believed that staying in the city, populated by so many nobles, was too dangerous for David. It would be better for him to venture out and experience the harsh realities of life. Perhaps after experiencing the harshness of real life, this arrogant boy would learn something. Even if that inexplicable contempt still lingered, he would know how to conceal it. Despite all his calculations, he had never imagined David would become the leader of the pioneering team, successfully establish a village, and return to Iron Tree Castle. Once the village was officially recognized by Iron Tree Keep and the Kingdom of Tiran, David's position as village chief would be confirmed, effectively freeing him from the constraints of commoner status. Lamenting the unpredictability of life, Addis briefly explained Alfie's situation. Don't overthink it. That child has nothing to do with me. I just found him, in the forest. Find him. It wasn't that David found the story outrageous. It was common for elven slaves to escape or be rescued and return to their tribe. It was understandable that she would find herself pregnant and give birth to a half-elf child after returning. And given the elves' attitude towards half-elves, it wasn't surprising that she would be abandoned. But how had Addis picked him up? And Alfie wasn't young anymore. If he'd been abandoned as a baby, wouldn't he have? Would he have raised her until she was an adult? Even if you're making up a lie to fool me, could you please put a little more thought into it and make it believable? In response to David's complaints, Addis finally sighed and told the truth. Actually, it was his mother who entrusted Alfie to me. His mother could return to her fellow tribesmen in the Ironwood Forest, but the child couldn't go with her, so you decided to adopt this child? This sounded strange, and David couldn't help but wonder if the old man had a deeper plan. Why did Alfie's mother entrust the child to you? The elf who rescued Alfie and his mother is my friend. Chapter 25 I will support you. It was completely unexpected that Addis, a true Iron Tree Keep native with thick eyebrows and big eyes, a face full of stubbornness, would actually rebel. David opened his mouth twice, finally uttering, "This is surprising." Thinking about it carefully, it wasn't particularly surprising. As a hunter, Addis's most common haunts were the forests, and the forests west of Iron Tree Keep were all elf territory. Even the edges of Iron Tree Forest and the surrounding smaller forests were also home to elves. In the eyes of the elves, these forests were their sphere of influence, and the hunters of Iron Tree Keep were essentially living on their territory. Addis was also a veteran hunter who thrived in the elves' territory. His decades of hunting career couldn't have failed him without encountering elves, and yet he hadn't been slain by the elves, but had thrived consistently. It was quite plausible that this veteran hunter had some connection to the elves. According to Addis, back in his youth, he unexpectedly encountered an elf hunter on the outskirts of the Ironwood Forest. Their initial reaction was no different from that of a typical human encountering an elf. Without a single word, they drew their bows and launched into a passionate exchange of arrows. They employed various tactics, but failed to slay the other, nearly being taken advantage of by a demonic beast. Faced with a greater threat, the two hunters of different races joined forces, forging a nascent friendship that would endure for decades. Listening to Addis's nostalgic expression as he recounted his friendship with another elf hunter, David was unsure how to respond. After all, Addis's description of his friendship with the elf hunter, Isolde, played a significant role in their friendship. It was through their harsh criticism of the nobles of Ironwood Castle that the man and the elf forged their bond. So, you helped the Aesop rescue Alfie and his mother, but because Alfie is half-elf and you were her savior, she trusted you enough to entrust her child to your care. After listening to Addis's story, David summarized the key points. Addis nodded, agreeing that David's summary was excellent. This was indeed the situation. You've heard about Alfie's situation. Now, what's your situation, me? David paused. What's my situation? Then, realizing Addis was referring to Laura, you mean Laura, of course, who else could I be talking about? Laura Croft was clearly a noble. Addis didn't know how David had gotten involved with one, and Alfie's situation made him a little paranoid, worried that his actions would be exposed and the nobles were targeting him. David wasn't comfortable explaining Laura's origins, but he knew what Addis was worried about. Don't worry about Laura. She's not a noble from Iron Tree Keep, or even from the Kingdom of Tiran, not from the Kingdom of Tiran. Hearing this, Addis's guard immediately dissipated. This continent had more than one human kingdom. Tiran was only the northernmost human kingdom, one of 4 powerful ones. Beyond that, there were many smaller powers, and even commoners like Addis didn't know how many human-dominated nations there were. So Addis didn't even ask where Laura came from, just knowing she wasn't out to cause trouble. However, David, whom he had raised and taught, was about to become village chief, married a noble woman, and even adopted a half-elf. Addis felt that if you lived long enough, you'd see all sorts of strange things. Let's go back. Since Laura wasn't an enemy, there was no need to avoid her. Addis began to seriously consider David's suggestion, take Alfie and move to Winter Village. While Laura wasn't a noble looking to cause trouble, Addis realized he might not be able to continue living in Iron Tree Keep. He couldn't endure the constant fear for much longer. Furthermore, how long could Alfie's identity be concealed? Covering his ears, which were noticeably different from those of humans, with cloth wasn't a reliable solution. If his identity were ever exposed, he wouldn't have much time to react. Better to get out of hiding quickly. But Addis remained concerned. Being a half-elf wouldn't change much once he left Iron Tree Keep, let alone the Kingdom of Tiran. Don't worry, Winter Village is pretty sparsely populated right now, and there aren't any nobles. Before he could even begin to speak, Addis quipped, isn't Laura living in Winter Village now? She's just staying temporarily, and after becoming the village chief's wife? She's still staying temporarily, isn't she? Village chief's wife? That title sounded incredibly lame. David suspected Laura wouldn't appreciate such a name, or perhaps she simply didn't care. After all, Laura's greatest passions were archaeology and adventure, etched deep within her soul. Slowly walking back to the door, Addis pondered the situation and made a decision, to move Alfie to Winter Village. According to David, Winter Village only had a few residents, all civilians. Even if Alfie's identity was exposed, it wouldn't be as dangerous as Iron Tree Keep. Winter Village was also far enough from Iron Tree Keep, its location being extremely remote. If anything were to happen, they could simply take Alfie and retreat deep into the forest. An old hunter with a half-elf should easily outmaneuver ordinary people in the forest. But before I leave, I need to say hello to that old friend, he said, needing to explain the situation to Aesop. Otherwise, how could he vanish without a word? I have to go into town tomorrow, after daybreak on some business. It should take a few days, plenty of time for you to say goodbye to your friend, and even for Alfie to say goodbye to his mother. David wanted to say that his Winter Village didn't tolerate racial antagonism, and that Alfie's mother could move there if she agreed, but he thought better of it and held back. They trusted Addis, their savior, by entrusting their child to him. They wouldn't trust David in the same way. In some ways, if David became the mayor of Winter Village, he would be exactly the kind of human the elves hated most. David, Addis called out just as David was about to open the door. Thank you. This thank you signified not only David's willingness to help him and Addis, but also David's willingness to return to him after establishing himself outside. In some ways, Addis had made the right choice. Thank you now? I'm going to take care of you in your old age? David would always remember the practical nurturing and life skills he'd received. If my life wasn't going as planned, if I struggled to survive, I wouldn't have cared. Now that my life was improving, and I was living a more comfortable life than many others in this world, if I didn't do something, then all my studies in my previous life would have been in vain. Pushing open the wooden door, David returned to his bed. He lay down without even glancing towards the bedroom, but suddenly said, "We'll be heading to the city after daybreak, so get some sleep." Addis, who had entered the house shortly after, glanced towards the bedroom and quietly sank back into bed. Soon, the familiar sound of snoring filled the room again. At dawn, the snoring ceased. Years of habit had conditioned the old hunter to wake up on time, and even a short break in sleep hadn't affected him in the slightest. David opened his eyes, too. Actually, he hadn't slept much, but had spent the entire night cultivating the holy light with his eyes closed. His physical fitness was now strong enough, and his mental strength was steadily increasing. This cultivation could barely replace sleep, though not truly. So, when he couldn't sleep, or when it wasn't the right time for him to, he used it to get through the night. The sound of dressing could be heard from the bedroom. Alfie was already dressed and emerged from his own bedroom, ready to wash and make breakfast for the others. "Alfie, your ears are showing." David's casual remark startled the already sluggish Alfie. He raised his hands to cover his ears, only to find the bandages securely tied to his head, the tops of his ears hidden within, not showing at all. Addis glanced at David speechlessly. He noticed that after more than 2 years of living out there, David hadn't become as calm as he'd expected, but had become even more mischievous. "Just trying to cheer him up," he said, greeting the nervous Alfie. "Don't worry, Addis already told me about your situation." Alfie glanced at Addis, then at David, then cautiously glanced at Laura, who had just emerged from another bedroom. Although Laura was dressed in commoner clothes, Alfie could see in her habits and traits that only aristocratic people could possess. Neatly dressed, her hair meticulously combed, not a single mess left, Laura said good morning to everyone. Finally, she looked at David, who was still struggling with his hair. "Are we heading into the city right away? We'll leave after breakfast." David wasn't sure how long the process would take, but he thought it would be best to go early. The staff weren't there yet? He wasn't worried. Addis's house was some distance from the inner city, a bit of a walk away. Of course, Such matters couldn't be handled in the outer city, which was full of civilians. They had to go to the inner city of Iron Tree Keep. David was also considering how to trick people into living in his winter village. It would be best if they could bring their own chickens, ducks, cattle, and horses, just like joining a pioneer group, and solve the livestock problem at the same time. Addis's comment on David's idea was simple: "You're probably still asleep." End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.